The styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee in Captain Elena Vance's hand didn't tremble when the first tectonic plate groaned beneath the Granite Peak Tactical Operations Center. But the way the black surface rippled in perfectly concentric circles told her that the 300 soldiers sleeping in the valley below were already in the path of a ghost they couldn't see. It was 03:14 on a Tuesday in the Bitterroot wilderness of Montana, and the air inside the command tent tasted of ozone and stale wintergreen dip. To the 30 other officers and enlisted personnel buzzing around the glowing monitors of the TOC, the world was stable, defined by the green icons of friendly units and the static-choked reports of night maneuvers. To Elena, the world was a living, breathing machine made of granite and schist, and she could feel it starting to break. She set the cup down on a folding map table, her movements slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to move growing up in Casper, Wyoming, where the wind could blow a person off a ridge if they weren't anchored to something solid. Elena was anchored by numbers, by the precise acoustic signatures she had been tracking for 72 hours on a handheld seismic monitor that no one had asked her to bring. She was here as a geological liaison for the 555th Engineer Brigade, a role Major Silas Thorne had reminded her twice was strictly advisory and largely ceremonial. To Thorne, the mountains were just terrain, a background for his tactical masterpiece, Operation Winter Hawk. To Elena, the mountain was the protagonist, and it was about to speak. She didn't run to the Major. Elena Vance didn't run for anything. She adjusted the sleeves of her ops, ensuring the fabric was crisp against her wrists, and walked with a measured pace toward the center of the tent where the brass gathered. Her boots made no sound on the heavy-duty plastic flooring. She was 32 years old, a woman who had spent more time studying the way subduction zones failed than she had studying the social hierarchies of the officers' mess. Her father had been a shift lead in the Powder River Basin mines, a man who could tell you a tunnel was going to collapse because the air smelled tired. Elena had refined that instinct into a PhD from Colorado School of Mines and a commission in the Army Corps of Engineers. She was the best structural geologist the service had, though the men in this room saw only a quiet captain with a ponytail and a stack of charts that took up space on their tactical displays. She stopped 3 feet from Major Thorne, waiting for the gap in the conversation. Thorne was a man of sharp angles and louder-than-necessary pronouncements, a West Point grad who wore his ambition like a physical weight. He was currently pointing at a topographical map of North Sentinel Ridge, the massive wall of rock that loomed over the valley where Alpha and Charlie companies were currently bunkered in for a simulated defense. "Major," Elena said, her voice low but carrying a frequency that cut through the chatter of radio operators. She didn't use a frantic tone. She used the tone of a surgeon describing a routine but necessary incision. Thorne didn't look up immediately. He finished his sentence about the placement of the mortar pits, then turned his head just enough to acknowledge her presence. He had a way of looking past her, as if she were a piece of equipment that hadn't been properly inventoried. "Captain Vance," Thorne said, his voice flat, "I thought we agreed that the environmental reports were finished on Sunday. We're in the middle of the live fire phase. Is there something about the slope stability that can't wait until the after-action review?" "The slope stability isn't the issue, sir," Elena said, her eyes fixed on his. She didn't blink. She had learned early in her career that blinking was seen as a sign of uncertainty by men like Thorne. "The deep-shelf seismic activity has shifted. There's a microfracture propagating through the bedrock of the North Sentinel base. We've had 3 events in the last 10 minutes, all of them under 2.0, but the frequency is tightening. The mountain is shedding its internal load. We need to move the companies out of the valley floor and onto the eastern plateau immediately." A few of the staff officers paused, their hands hovering over keyboards. The silence in the tent grew heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Thorne let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, the fabric of his uniform straining against his shoulders. "Captain, I appreciate the academic diligence. I really do. But we've got 300 men in the middle of a cold weather certification. Moving them now, based on a few ripples in your coffee or whatever it is you're tracking on that toy, would scrub the entire exercise. It would cost the taxpayers $500,000 and set our readiness back 6 months." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so it was just for her, though everyone was listening. You were assigned to this unit to ensure we didn't accidentally contaminate a stream or disturb a protected nesting site. You're a distraction to the mission, Captain. Go back to your tent, write your report, and if the mountain is still standing in the morning, I'll read it over breakfast." Elena felt the heat crawl up the back of her neck, but she didn't let it touch her face. She didn't argue. Arguing was for people who weren't sure of their data. She looked at the map, then at the major. She saw the ego, the desire for a clean report to send up to the colonel, and the fundamental blindness of a man who thought the Earth was a static stage for his ego. "The mountain doesn't care about your readiness, Major," she said quietly. "And it doesn't care about your budget. It's moving. If you don't move those men, the North Sentinel won't just be a ridge anymore. It'll be a tomb." "Dismissed, Captain," Thorne said, his voice turning cold as iron. He turned his back to her, dismissing her not just from the conversation, but from the reality of the room. Elena turned and walked out. She didn't go back to her tent. She walked toward the edge of the TOC perimeter, where the light of the flood lamps died against the absolute black of the Montana forest. The air was bitingly cold, the kind of cold that crystallized the breath in her lungs. She reached into the pocket of her field jacket and pulled out her handheld unit. The screen was a grid of red lines. The lines weren't jagged anymore. They were rhythmic, a heartbeat. The mountain was pulsing. She looked up at the silhouette of North Sentinel Ridge, a jagged tooth of rock that blotted out the stars. It looked eternal. It looked immovable. But Elena knew that everything moved if you applied enough pressure to the right point. She felt a presence behind her and didn't have to turn to know who it was. Corporal Miller, a 20-year-old kid from a farm in Ohio who had been assigned as her driver and general assistant, was standing there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Miller was the only one who had watched her over the last 3 days. He had seen her kneeling in the dirt with a stethoscope-like device pressed to the rock. He had seen the way she stopped talking and just listened to the air. "He didn't listen, did he, ma'am?" Miller asked. His voice was small, swallowed by the vastness of the woods. "No, Miller, he didn't listen," Elena replied. She was looking at the coordinates on her screen. She was calculating the velocity of the potential debris flow. If the fracture gave way at the point she suspected, the entire western face of the ridge would come down. It wouldn't be a slide, it would be a collapse. 1,000,000 tons of rock moving at 100 miles an hour. It would hit the valley floor in less than 60 seconds. "What do we do?" Miller asked. He wasn't asking as a subordinate, he was asking as someone who had seen the look in her eyes. "We do the only thing we can," Elena said. She turned to him, her face a mask of controlled competence. "We get to the high ground, and we wait for the sound." "The sound, ma'am?" "The sound of the world ending," she said. She led Miller to their Humvee, a battered vehicle that smelled of old upholstery and CLP. She didn't check out through the main gate. She used her knowledge of the fire roads, paths she had scouted on their first day, roads that the tactical maps didn't emphasize because they weren't wide enough for a convoy. She drove with a precision that Miller found unsettling. She didn't use her high beams. She navigated by the moonlight and the shape of the trees. Every few minutes, she would reach out and touch the dashboard, not to steady herself, but to feel the vibration of the engine against the vibration of the ground. The two were beginning to sink. As they climbed the access road toward the eastern plateau, the very ground she had told Thorne to move the troops to, Elena thought about Casper. She thought about the day the sirens had gone off at the Black Thunder mine. She had been 12. Her mother had been hanging laundry, and the sound hadn't been an explosion. It had been a long, low sigh, as if the earth were finally exhaling after holding its breath for 1 billion years. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The silence was the sound of air being cut off. Her father had come home 12 hours later, covered in a dust so fine it looked like gray skin. He hadn't said a word. He had just sat at the kitchen table and cried without making a sound. He had known the mountain was tired. He had told his supervisor. The supervisor had called him a superstitious old hand and told him to get back to the face. 8 men had died because a supervisor didn't like the way a miner talked about the feel of the rock. Elena would not let that happen again. She wasn't a miner with a feeling. She was a scientist with a sensor, but the result was the same. The institutional arrogance of men who believed they could command the physical world was a disease. She looked at her watch. 03:42. "Miller," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the heater. "Get on the radio, not the command net. The short-range tactical frequency for Alpha Company's lead sergeant. I know Sergeant First Class Holloway. He's a bridge builder. He knows what a landslide looks like." "Ma'am, if I go around the major." If you go around the major, you might get a page 11. If you don't, you're going to be helping me dig out bodies for the next month. Pick one. Miller didn't hesitate. He started flipping the toggles on the sinker's unit. The static was a physical presence in the cab. He called for Holloway once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, a voice cracked through, thick with sleep and irritation. "This is Holloway. Who the hell is this on the secure net?" "Sergeant, this is Captain Vance," Elena said, leaning over the console. "Listen to me very carefully. You're parked in the shadow of the North Sentinel runoff. I need you to wake your men. Don't wait for a command from the TOC. Just get them into the trucks and move them 500 yards east. Now." "Captain, what are you talking about? The Major's got us on a 6-hour rest cycle. If I start cranking engines now, I'll have his boot so far up my—" "Sergeant," Elena interrupted, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something cold and undeniable. "The bedrock under your boots is currently shearing. In less than 20 minutes, that ridge is going to come down. I am not asking you as an officer. I am telling you as a geologist who wants you to see your kids again. Move the men." There was a long silence on the other end. Holloway was a man who lived in the world of mud and steel. He knew Elena. He had watched her measuring the tilt of a temporary bridge 3 days ago and had seen her correct his master sergeant on a load-bearing calculation that turned out to be exactly right. "Is it that bad, Vance?" Holloway asked, the irritation gone. "It's worse," she said. "Copy that. I'm waking them up, but if the Major kills me, I'm haunting your office." "Understood." Out, Elena pulled the Humvee onto a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. From this vantage point, she could see the faint glint of moonlight on the tops of the tents where Alpha and Charlie companies were bivouacked. She could see the tiny, ant-like movements of soldiers beginning to stir as Holloway started his unsanctioned evacuation. To her right, North Sentinel Ridge stood like a silent executioner. It was a beautiful, terrifying wall of stone, 5,000 feet of vertical intent. "Look," Elena whispered. She pointed to the base of the ridge. A plume of dust, barely visible in the dark, was beginning to rise. It wasn't blown by the wind. It was being pushed out from the inside. It looked like the ridge was smoking. Back at the TOC, the sensors began to scream. Not the seismic sensors Elena had brought, but the perimeter alarms and the low-frequency mics used to detect incoming artillery. In the command tent, Major Thorne was staring at a screen that was suddenly filled with error messages. "What is that?" Thorne barked, his hand hovering over the radio handset. "Is that a simulated strike? I didn't authorize a simulated strike for this hour." "Sir, it's not a simulation," the young specialist at the monitor said, his voice trembling. "The ground sensors are reporting a mass movement event. It's the ridge, sir. It's coming from the ridge." Thorne felt a cold needle of dread prick the back of his neck. He remembered the quiet captain with the ponytail. He remembered her saying the word *tomb**. He snatched the handset. "Alpha Lead, this is Thorne. Report status." "Charlie Lead, report." The radio stayed silent for a heartbeat, then Holloway's voice came through, strained and accompanied by the roar of diesel engines. "Major, this is Holloway. We're evacuating the valley floor. Captain Vance gave us the word. We're moving east, but Charlie is still in their bags. They're not responding to the short range." The radio didn't go dead. It was drowned out. From her outcrop, Elena Vance saw it happen in slow motion. First, a line of white fire seemed to zip across the top of the ridge, the moon reflecting off the newly exposed quartz as the mountain cracked open. Then, the sound reached them. It wasn't a crash. It was a roar that felt like it was being generated inside Elena's own chest. It was the sound of the earth being torn in half. The entire western face of North Sentinel Ridge simply ceased to be a vertical surface. It became a liquid. 1,000,000 tons of ancient stone, trees, and ice collapsed into a gray, churning wave that swallowed the moonlight. "Oh my God," Miller whispered, his hand gripping the door handle of the Humvee so hard his knuckles were white. The wave hit the valley floor with the force of a nuclear detonation. A cloud of pulverized rock and debris billowed upward, rising 1,000 feet into the air, obscuring the tents, the trucks, and the lives of the men below. The ground beneath the Humvee bucked and heaved. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands on the steering wheel, her eyes wide and unblinking. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't praying. She was calculating. She was watching the way the debris flow branched, the way it hammered into the opposite canyon wall, and the way the dust cloud began to roll toward the TOC. "The talk," Elena said, her voice sharp. "The collapse triggered a secondary slide on the southern spur. It's heading right for the command center." She didn't wait for Miller to respond. She slammed the Humvee into gear and spun the wheel. While every other vehicle in the area was likely paralyzed or trying to flee the chaos, Elena Vance was driving toward it. She knew the geography. She knew that the southern spur was a mix of loose scree and clay. It wouldn't be a mountain killer like the main collapse, but it would be enough to bury the command tent and everyone in it if they didn't get out in the next 3 minutes. She drove like a woman possessed by a cold, mathematical demon. She bounced the Humvee over boulders and through brush, taking a direct line back down the ridge. In the distance, she could see the lights of the TOC flickering. They were losing power. "Radio them, Miller," she shouted over the roar of the wind and the groaning of the mountain. "Tell Thorne to get them out of the tent and into the armored vehicles. Now!" Miller was fumbling with the radio, his face pale in the green light of the dash. "I can't get through, the interference from the dust. It's all static." Elena didn't slow down. She could see the secondary slide now. It looked like a dark river of mud and stone sliding down the spur, moving with a deceptive, silent grace. It was aiming for the cluster of lights that marked the heart of the exercise. She reached the TOC perimeter just as the first wave of the dust cloud hit. It was like driving into a wall of gray flour. Visibility dropped to 0. Elena navigated by memory and the slope of the ground. She felt the Humvee lurch as it hit the plastic flooring of the motor pool area. She slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt just inches from the main command tent. She leaped out of the cab, the air so thick with grit she had to pull her collar over her nose to breathe. Inside the tent, chaos had replaced the military precision of an hour ago. The lights were flickering, the air was filled with the smell of burning electronics, and men were shouting over each other. Major Thorne was standing in the center, looking at a map that was no longer relevant, his face a mask of paralyzed shock. He was a man trained for war, for bullets and bombs, for enemies he could see and hate. He had no training for a world that simply fell down. Elena didn't salute. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed Thorne by the tactical vest and yanked him toward her. The sudden movement snapped him out of his daze. "Major, look at me," she yelled. "The southern spur is failing. We have less than 90 seconds before this tent is buried. Get your people into the strikers. Move them to the motor pool now." Thorne looked at her, and for the first time he really saw her. He didn't see a distraction. He saw the only person in the room who knew what to do. Is everyone. Alpha is clear, Charlie is a question mark, but if you stay here, you're dead. Move." Thorne found his voice. "Everyone to the strikers, leave the gear, go, go, go." The evacuation was a blur of shadows and screaming. Elena stayed at the flap of the tent, counting the bodies as they ran past her. She wasn't thinking about her career or the fact that she had just assaulted a superior officer. She was thinking about the weight of the clay moving down the hill. She could feel it in her feet. The vibration was changing. It was becoming a heavy, wet thud. The last of the radio operators scrambled out, and Thorne followed, pausing to look at Elena. "Captain, let's go. Get in the lead vehicle," she commanded. She watched them scramble into the armored belly of a striker. The massive engine roared to life, the tires spinning in the rising mud. Just as the last ramp closed, the mountain arrived. It wasn't a roar this time. It was a wet, heavy sound, like a wet carpet being dropped on a floor. The dark river of the secondary slide slammed into the TOC. The main tent disappeared in a heartbeat, crushed and buried under 6 feet of mud and stone. The Humvee Elena had been driving was tossed aside like a toy. Elena was already moving. She had seen the trajectory. She had tucked herself behind the reinforced concrete barrier of a permanent generator housing just as the slide hit. The world went black. The sound of the debris hitting the barrier was like being inside a drum. She felt the pressure of the earth pressing against the concrete, the weight of 1,000 years of geological history trying to squeeze the life out of the present. Then, silence. The dust began to settle. Elena pushed herself up from the ground. She was covered in gray silt, her lungs burning, her hands shaking with a fine, high-frequency tremor. She looked around. The TOC was gone. Where there had been a bustling command center, there was now a flat, silent field of mud and broken poles. 100 yards away, the strikers were idling, their headlights cutting through the settling dust like searchlights in a fog. Elena stood up, wiping the grit from her eyes. She felt a strange, detached calm. She had been right. The cost of being right was the destruction of everything around her, but she was alive. And more importantly, she could hear the shouting. "Over here, we need a medic." It was Holloway's voice coming from the edge of the main debris field. Elena didn't wait for the strikers to find her. She started walking toward the sound. She walked over the buried remains of the Major's maps and the broken pieces of the world he thought he controlled. She didn't look back at the mountain. She knew what it had done. She was already looking for the next fracture, the next weakness, the next place where the earth was tired of being stepped on. As she reached the edge of the valley, she saw the lights of Alpha Company. They were scattered, battered, and covered in the same gray dust, but they were standing. Holloway saw her coming and pointed a flashlight her way. "Vance!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "You beautiful, crazy scientist, you actually did it." Elena didn't smile. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a witness. She reached Holloway and looked out over the ruins of the valley floor. Charlie Company's camp was gone, buried under 30 feet of rock, but she saw movement. Figures were crawling out of the periphery, men who had heard Holloway's warning and had just enough time to reach the edge of the flow. "How many?" she asked, her voice rasping. "I don't know yet," Holloway said, "but without that call, it would have been all of them." A shadow loomed out of the dust behind them. Major Thorne walked toward them, his uniform torn, his face pale and smeared with mud. He looked at the valley, then at the buried TOC, and finally at Elena. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of his own soul and didn't like what he found there. "Captain Vance," he said. His voice was a whisper. He didn't have the angles anymore. He looked soft, broken by the weight of the reality he had ignored. Elena stood straight, her heels clicking together in the mud. "Major, I need to get a report to the colonel," he stammered. "I need to explain." "The mountain explained it for you, sir," Elena said. She looked him in the eye, and this time he was the one who blinked. "Now, if you'll excuse me, we have people to dig out." She turned away from him, her focus shifting back to the ground. She didn't need his validation. She didn't need his apology. She needed a shovel and a sensor. She was Captain Elena Vance, and she was the only one who knew exactly where the bodies would be, because she was the only one who had been listening when the mountain told her where it was going to put them. She began to walk toward the debris, her boots sinking into the wet earth. Behind her, the sun was just beginning to touch the jagged, broken peaks of the Bitterroot Range, turning the dust cloud into a haze of gold. It was a beautiful morning, and the world was quiet again. But as Elena knelt by a protruding piece of a Charlie Company tent, she pressed her palm to the cold, wet stone. She didn't hear the silence. She heard the deep, low vibration of the earth resetting itself, the slow, tectonic grind of a world that was never finished moving. She knew that this was only the beginning. The mountain had collapsed, but the earth was still speaking, and for the first time in her life, she realized that she was no longer the only one who was going to have to listen. She looked up as a second, larger tremor shook the ground, a secondary collapse from the northern peak. The soldiers around her froze, their eyes wide with a new, raw kind of terror. They looked at the mountain, then they looked at Thorne, who was standing frozen in the middle of the mud. Finally, as if by some unspoken command, every eye in the valley turned to her. Elena Vance didn't say a word. She stood up, wiped the mud from her knees, and began to move toward the new sound. She didn't look back to see if they were following. She knew they were. For the first time in the history of the 555th, the rank on her shoulders didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the way she walked, with the absolute, unwavering confidence of a woman who knew exactly how much the world weighed, and exactly what it took to keep it from crushing them all. The mountain was still falling, but Elena Vance was the only thing in the valley that wasn't afraid of the dark. She reached the edge of the new slide, where the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and crushed pine, and she didn't stop. She stepped into the chaos, her hands reaching for the first stone, her mind already mapping the silence beneath the roar. "Miller!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the broken cliffs. "Bring the seismic spikes, we're not done yet." The corporal scrambled to obey, his boots slipping in the muck, but his eyes fixed on her back. He wasn't following a captain anymore. He was following the only person who knew the way out of the grave they were all standing in. And as the first light of the Montana sun hit the valley, Elena Vance began to dig, her movements precise, her face set in a mask of controlled, professional grace, while the rest of the world finally began to realize that the distraction was the only thing that was going to save them. But as she pulled the first survivor from the silt, a young private with a broken arm and eyes full of glass, Elena felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She looked at her handheld monitor, which was lying on a flat rock nearby. The red lines weren't pulsing anymore. They were flat, perfectly flat. In geology, a flat line didn't mean the movement had stopped. It meant the pressure was building somewhere else, somewhere deeper. She looked at the jagged scar where the North Sentinel had been, and then she looked past it, toward the heart of the range where the massive, dormant volcanic pipes of the Idaho batholith lay hidden beneath the granite. The collapse hadn't been the end of the event. It had been the trigger. She stood up, her heart hammered against her ribs for the first time that night. She looked at the hundreds of soldiers, the idling strikers, and the broken major. They thought the danger was over. They thought they had survived the mountain. Elena Vance knew better. She knew that when a mountain as large as the North Sentinel falls, it doesn't just change the map. It changes the plumbing of the earth itself. And the sound she was starting to hear now, a low, rhythmic thumping deep beneath her boots, wasn't the sound of rock falling. It was the sound of something waking up. She reached for her radio, her fingers hovering over the transmit button. She had to tell them. She had to make them move again, even though they were exhausted, even though they were broken. She looked at Major Thorne, who was finally beginning to coordinate the rescue, a look of grim determination on his face. He thought he was regaining control. Elena clicked the radio. "Thorne, get the men to the vehicles. We have to go, now." "Vance, for God's sake, we just got here. We have survivors too." "Major," she said, her voice a whip crack in the morning air. "The mountain didn't just collapse. It unzipped a fault line we didn't know existed. Look at the river." Thorne turned. The Bitterroot River, which ran through the center of the valley, was no longer flowing. The water was receding, being sucked back into the earth as if a giant drain had been opened in the riverbed. "What is that?" Thorne whispered. "That's the earth taking a breath," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first plumes of steam were beginning to rise from the forest floor. "And in about 5 minutes it's going to exhale." She didn't wait for his order. She grabbed the private she had just rescued and slung his good arm over her shoulder. "Miller, everyone in the trucks, move." She was the first one moving, not away from the danger, but toward the only exit route that wouldn't be underwater or under fire in 10 minutes. She was the only one who saw the full shape of the nightmare they had walked into, and as she led the line of battered soldiers toward the high pass, Elena Vance realized that the mountain hadn't just collapsed. It had opened a door, and whatever was on the other side was already coming through. The ground beneath them began to hum, a high-pitched metallic vibration that made their teeth ache. Elena didn't look back. She knew the cost of looking back. She just kept her eyes on the pass, her feet finding the solid ground in a world that was turning to liquid, the only woman in the world who knew that the worst was yet to come. She reached the crest of the pass just as the first explosion of steam and ash shattered the valley floor behind them. She didn't flinch. She just kept moving, her silhouette sharp against the rising fire, a small, defiant figure leading an army of ghosts into the unknown. But as she reached the top, she stopped. The road ahead was gone, not buried, not blocked. It had simply vanished into a steaming, jagged chasm that stretched as far as the eye could see. Elena Vance looked at the chasm, then at the fire rising behind her, and finally at the 300 men who were looking to her for the next move. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, battered compass that had belonged to her father, and watched the needle spin in useless, frantic circles. The magnetic poles of the valley were shifting. "Ma'am," Miller asked, his voice trembling, "what do we do now?" Elena Vance closed her eyes for a single second, feeling the vibration of the earth, the heat of the rising steam, and the weight of the lives resting on her shoulders. When she opened them, the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, brilliant clarity. "We go down," she said, pointing into the dark, steaming depths of the chasm. "Into that?" Thorne gasped, catching up to her. "That's suicide." "No," Elena said, her voice echoing with a strange, haunting authority. "That's the only way through. The mountain didn't just break, Major. It showed us the path. Now follow me or stay here and burn." She stepped off the edge of the cliff, her boots finding a hidden ledge in the steam, and vanished into the earth. For a heartbeat, the soldiers stood on the brink of the abyss, watching the smoke swallow her. Then, one by one, led by Miller and followed finally by a silent Major Thorne, they began to disappear after her. The mountain had collapsed and the world was ending, but Captain Elena Vance was still moving, and in the heart of the breaking earth, she was the only light they had left. The descent into the chasm was a journey into a pre-human world. The walls were slick with condensation, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and ancient trapped gases. Elena led them with a rhythmic, mechanical pace, her hand never leaving the rock face. She wasn't using her eyes anymore. She was using her skin. She could feel the heat gradients, the subtle changes in air pressure that signaled a cavern or a dead end. Behind her, the 300 soldiers moved like a funeral procession. The only sounds were the scraping of boots on stone and the occasional sob of a man who had reached his breaking point. Major Thorne was near the middle of the line, his hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had ceased to be an officer of the United States Army. He was a passenger in a reality he no longer understood. "Keep the line tight." Elena's voice floated back through the steam, calm and anchored. "If you lose the person in front of you, stay still and shout. Don't wander." She found a natural tunnel, a lava tube that had been cold for 10,000 years. It was wide enough for two men to walk abreast, and the air was cooler here, filtered through the layers of limestone above. She increased the pace, sensing the urgency of the tectonic shift above them. The valley floor they had just left was likely a lake of fire by now, but down here in the dark marrow of the mountain, there was a strange, terrifying peace. After what felt like hours, the tunnel began to slope upward. The air grew fresher, the scent of pine needles and damp earth cutting through the sulfur. Elena stopped, her hand held high. "Wait here," she commanded. She climbed a steep, rocky chimney, her fingers finding grips that shouldn't have been there. She emerged into the cool night air, the stars overhead blurred by a thick canopy of old-growth cedar. She was 5 miles from the valley floor, on the far side of the North Sentinel Range. She looked back. The horizon was a jagged line of orange light. The entire North Sentinel Valley was a cauldron of volcanic activity, a localized eruption triggered by the massive structural failure of the ridge. It looked like a wound on the surface of the earth. She reached down and helped Miller up, then Holloway, and then the rest of them. They emerged from the earth like men being born for the second time, blinking at the starlight, their faces smeared with gray ash and white salt. When the last man was out, Elena stood on a fallen cedar log and watched them. They were huddled together, some weeping, some staring blankly into the woods. Major Thorne was the last to climb out. He stood before her, his chest heaving, his eyes hollow. He looked at the fire in the distance, then at his men, and finally at Elena. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. He simply reached up, unpinned the silver oak leaf of his rank from his collar, and held it out to her in a trembling hand. Elena looked at the leaf, then at him. She didn't take it. "Keep it, Major," she said, her voice quiet and tired. "You're going to need it to explain why you're the one who survived." She turned away from him, looking toward the north, where the lights of a distant town flickered like a promise. "Miller," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Find a road, let's go home." She started walking through the woods, her boots heavy with the mud of a world that had tried to bury her. She didn't look back at the fire or the mountain or the man who had called her a distraction. She just watched the way the needle of her compass was finally, slowly, beginning to point north again. The mission was over. The mountain was gone. But Elena Vance was still moving, her heart beating in time with the quiet, steady rhythm of the earth, the only thing in the wilderness that knew exactly where it was going. As they reached the edge of the forest and the first headlights of a rescue convoy appeared in the distance, Elena stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky. The stars were clear now, the dust having settled into the low valleys. She felt a single, cold drop of rain hit her cheek. She smiled, a small, private thing that no one else saw. The earth was exhaling, and this time it was just rain. She stepped out onto the asphalt of the mountain road, her silhouette caught in the bright, high beams of the lead Humvee. A soldier leaped out, his rifle at the ready, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "Identify yourself," he shouted. Elena Vance stood her ground, her shadow long and steady on the road. She didn't look like a captain. She didn't look like a scientist. She looked like something carved out of the mountain itself. "Captain Elena Vance," she said, her voice clear and undeniable. "And I've brought your army back from the dead." The soldier lowered his rifle, his eyes widening as he saw the line of 300 men emerging from the trees behind her. He looked at Elena, then at the fire on the horizon, and finally back to her. "How?" he whispered. Elena didn't answer. She just kept walking, her boots clicking on the pavement, a sound that was sharp and precise and perfectly, wonderfully human. She didn't need to explain. The mountain had already said everything that needed to be said. And as the sun began to rise over the Montana plains, Elena Vance finally let go of the mountain's breath and took one of her own. It was cold and it was fresh, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. She didn't stop until she reached the back of a waiting ambulance, where she sat on the bumper and let a medic wrap a blanket around her shoulders. She didn't close her eyes. She just watched the sun climb higher, turning the world from gray to gold, the only woman in the world who knew that no matter how much the earth moved, She was never going to be moved again. But then her radio, still clipped to her vest, crackled to life with a frequency she hadn't heard in years. A deep space military band reserved for the highest level of national emergencies. "Captain Vance," a voice said, stripped of emotion and heavy with an authority that made the air around her feel thick. "This is Raven Rock. The North Sentinel event was registered on our global arrays. It wasn't the only one. We have 3 more ridges failing in the Appalachians and a shelf slipping in the Pacific. We need the woman who heard it coming." Elena looked at the radio, then at the rising sun. The cost of being right was never a one-time payment. "I'm here," she said, her voice as steady as the bedrock she had just escaped. "Tell me where the Earth is tired." She stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and walked toward the waiting helicopter that was already screaming across the sky toward her. The mountain had collapsed, but the world was still breaking, and Elena Vance was the only one moving toward it. The cabin of the VH-60 White Hawk smelled of ionized air and the sweat of men who hadn't slept in 48 hours. But Captain Elena Vance only noticed the way the flight medic's hands shook as he tried to strap her into the nylon seat. He was a master sergeant, 3 stripes and 3 rockers on his sleeve, a man who had likely seen IED strikes in the Kunar Valley, yet he couldn't get the buckle to click because his eyes were fixed on the thermal feed of the Montana wilderness retreating below them. On the screen, the Bitterroot Range didn't look like mountains anymore. It looked like a row of broken teeth bleeding liquid heat. Elena reached out, her fingers still caked in the gray silt of the North Sentinel, and placed her hand over his. The shaking stopped. She didn't say it was going to be all right because she was a geologist and she knew the mathematics of the crust too well to lie. She just held his hand steady until the buckle clicked. Then she turned her gaze to the window, watching the orange glow of the Earth's fever fade into the distance. Corporal Miller sat across from her, his knees knocking against hers in the cramped space. He was still holding the seismic sensor unit like it was a holy relic. His face was a mask of pale exhaustion, his eyes darting between Elena and the 2 men in suits who sat in the rear of the cabin, their faces illuminated by the blue light of encrypted tablets. They weren't army. They had the polished, soulless look of the DC Beltway, men who lived in the windowless offices of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They hadn't spoken since they hauled Elena and Miller off the mountain road. They hadn't offered water. They had only offered a satellite phone and a demand for her raw data. The flight lasted 4 hours, a blur of vibration and the steady, rhythmic beat of the rotor blades. They refueled midair over Nebraska, the dark silhouette of a KC-135 stratotanker looming above them like a nursing mother bird. Elena didn't sleep. She spent the time watching the seismic spikes on her handheld unit. The lines were no longer flat. They were shivering in a low-frequency harmonic that she had only ever seen in computer simulations of the big one. But these weren't coming from the West Coast. The signals were originating from the Craton, the ancient, stable heart of the North American plate. The stable ground was becoming unstable, and that meant the rules of the world were being rewritten in real time. "Ma'am," Miller whispered, leaning in close so the NGA agents couldn't hear him over the drone of the engines. "Where are they taking us? This isn't Fort Lewis. This isn't even the Pentagon." Elena looked at the GPS coordinates flickering on the cockpit's secondary display. She recognized the heading. "We're heading for Blue Ridge Summit, Miller, the underground. If the world is falling apart, the people in charge want to be under 500 feet of greenstone when it happens." "Raven Rock," Miller breathed. The name was a legend in the ranks, the underground Pentagon, the place where the chain of command went to hide when the nuclear sirens started to wail. The White Hawk began its descent just as the sun started to bleed over the Pennsylvania horizon. They didn't land at an airport. They flared over a heavily guarded clearing surrounded by triple-strand concertina wire and concrete guard towers manned by soldiers in black tactical gear who didn't look like they belonged to any standard infantry unit. The landing was hard, the wheels hitting the reinforced pad with a jolt that sent a spike of pain through Elena's bruised ribs. The door slid open, and the transition from the cool mountain air of Montana to the humid, heavy air of the East Coast hit her like a physical blow. "Captain Vance, Corporal Miller, move," one of the suits said. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was as dry as parchment. They were marched across the tarmac toward a massive steel door set into the side of the mountain. It looked like the entrance to a tomb, But as the hydraulic locks hissed and the 10-ton slab of steel slid back, Elena saw a world of white light and polished linoleum. This was the entrance to the Alternate Joint Communications Center. This was where the United States intended to outlast the end of the world. The interior of Raven Rock was a maze of tunnels, each one wide enough for 2 Humvees to pass. The air smelled of ozone, industrial-grade floor wax, and the faint, metallic tang of recycled oxygen. There were no windows, no clocks that didn't show Zulu time, and no sense of the sun or the wind. It was a sterile, high-pressure environment designed to keep the human mind focused on the mission while the planet outside burned. Elena felt the weight of the mountain above her. Thousands of tons of rock that she knew better than anyone was not as solid as the generals liked to believe. They were stripped of their gear in a decontamination room. Elena watched as a technician in a yellow hazmat suit placed her seismic sensor into a lead-lined box. "That stays with me," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "It's being screened for radiation and biological contaminants, Captain," the technician said without looking up. "Standard protocol. The protocol is for a nuclear event," Elena countered, stepping toward him. She didn't raise her voice, but there was a frequency in it that made the man pause. "That unit contains the only high-fidelity seismic record of a secondary tectonic unzipping in the history of the United States. If you drop it, or if your screening equipment interferes with the solid-state drive, we lose the map of what's coming next. Give it to me." A door at the far end of the room opened, and a man in the uniform of a lieutenant general stepped through. He was lean, with silver hair cropped close to a skull that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, cold, deep, and unforgiving. He didn't look at the technician. He looked at Elena. "Give the captain her equipment," the general said. The technician hesitated for a fraction of a second, then handed the box to Elena. She took it, the weight of the device familiar and grounding. She didn't thank the general. She waited. "I'm General Arthur Henderson, Deputy Director of the Joint Staff," the man said. He didn't offer a hand. "I've spent the last 3 hours reading the preliminary report from a Major Silas Thorne. He paints a very dramatic picture of your actions in Montana, Captain Vance. He also suggests you are prone to insubordination and academic alarmism." Elena stood straight, her heels together, her gaze level with the general's. "Major Thorne is currently trying to justify why he ignored a 72-hour warning and nearly lost 2 companies of combat engineers, sir. His assessment of my character is as flawed as his understanding of slope stability." Henderson's lips thinned into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Thorne is a careerist. I have no use for careerists today. I have a room full of Ivy League geologists telling me that the North Sentinel event was a localized volcanic anomaly caused by a pocket of trapped gas. I have the Secretary of Defense asking me why I've activated the Raven Rock protocols for a landslide. And then I have your data." He turned and began walking down the corridor. "Follow me, and keep your driver close. I'm told he's the only one who saw what you saw before the ridge came down." Elena glanced at Miller, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the wall. She gave him a sharp, infinitesimal nod, and they followed the general into the heart of the mountain. They passed through 3 more sets of security doors, each requiring a retinal scan and a thumbprint. The deeper they went, the more frantic the energy became. Couriers were running between offices, the air was thick with the chatter of 100 keyboards, and the hum of the massive server farms beneath their feet was a constant, low-frequency vibration. They entered the National Military Command Center, the War Room. It was a tiered theater dominated by a screen the size of a billboard. On the screen was a map of the United States, dotted with hundreds of pulsing yellow icons. "The Ivy League says it's localized," Henderson said, gesturing to the map. "They say the Yellowstone plume is stable. They say the North American plate is a solid block of granite. But in the last 6 hours, we've had 11 events of magnitude 4 or higher along the 38th parallel. Not on the faults, not on the edges, in the middle, in Kansas, in Kentucky, in Virginia." Elena walked down the ramp toward the main console. She didn't ask for permission. She set her seismic unit on the glass desk of a startled colonel and plugged it into the interface. Her fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the polished NGA visualizations and pulling up the raw acoustic data she had captured in Montana. "It's not volcanic, General," she said, her voice filling the silent room. "And it's not localized. The North Sentinel collapse was a fracture release. Think of the tectonic plate like a sheet of tempered glass. If you hit it in the right spot with enough force, the energy doesn't just stay where you hit it. It travels. It finds the internal stresses, the manufacturing defects, and it unzips them. She hit a key, and a three-dimensional model of the North American craton appeared on the big screen. It was crisscrossed with thousands of fine, red lines, hidden faults that had been silent for millions of years. What you're seeing in Kansas and Kentucky aren't new earthquakes. Elena continued, the dark competence of a master of her craft taking over. They are echoes. The North Sentinel was the keystone. When it failed, it sent a shockwave through the midcrustal layers. The plate is trying to readjust to a new equilibrium, but it's doing it too fast. The energy is cascading. A cascade, Henderson whispered, like a row of dominoes. Except each domino is the size of a mountain range, sir, Elena said. A woman in a lab coat, her face pinched with academic indignation, stepped forward from the shadows of the lower tier. General, this is pure speculation. Captain Vance's specialty is structural geology, not global seismology. The statistical probability of a continental-scale cascade is... The statistical probability of North Sentinel Ridge falling down was 0 according to your models, Dr. Aris. Elena interrupted, not even looking at the woman. She kept her eyes on the data. You were looking at the surface. I was listening to the bone structure. General, look at the frequency on the Virginia station. She pointed to a jagged line on the side of the screen. It was a rhythmic, pulsing wave, identical to the one she had seen in Montana before the world fell apart. That's the Central Virginia seismic zone, Elena said. It's 60 miles from where we are standing. It's been building pressure for 40 minutes. If my model is correct, the cascade has reached the eastern seaboard. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. Then a voice crackled over the intercom from the communications hub. General, we have a report from the USCs, magnitude 5.8 near Louisa, Virginia. Shaking felt in D.C., Richmond, and as far north as New York. They're calling it a standalone event. It's not standalone, Elena said, her voice cold and certain. It's the next link in the chain. Henderson looked at the screen, then at Elena. For the first time, the coldness in his eyes was replaced by something else. Recognition. He saw that she wasn't guessing. She was reading the planet like a manual. Captain, he said, if you're right, where does the chain end? Elena zoomed out on the map. She followed the line of the 38th parallel east past the Virginia coast into the dark blue of the Atlantic. She stopped the cursor on a cluster of volcanic islands off the coast of Africa. The Canary Islands, specifically the island of La Palma. It ends there, she said. The Cumbre Vieja volcano, it's been unstable for decades. A massive seismic pulse traveling through the oceanic crust could be the trigger that drops the western flank of the island into the sea. And if that happens, Miller asked, his voice a small, terrified croak in the back of the room. Elena didn't answer him. She looked at Henderson. If the flank of La Palma collapses, it creates a mega tsunami, a wall of water 100 feet high moving at the speed of a jet liner. It hits the east coast in 8 hours. It wipes out everything from Miami to Maine. The war room exploded into chaos. The doctor, arises of the room, began shouting about over-extrapolation and the impossibility of transoceanic triggers. The colonels began scrambling for phone lines, but General Henderson didn't move. He stood looking at the map, his hands clasped behind his back, a man watching the arrival of a war he couldn't win with a carrier group. You're asking me to evacuate the entire eastern seaboard based on a theory that hasn't been peer-reviewed, Henderson said, his voice low. I'm telling you that the mountain is tired, General, Elena said, and it's about to lie down. You have 7 hours and 52 minutes to decide if you want to be the man who saved the Atlantic coast or the man who watched it drown because he was waiting for a peer review. Henderson turned to a communications officer. Get the president on the secure line. Tell him we have a red sky situation, and get me the commander of the Atlantic Fleet. He turned back to Elena. Captain Vance, you are now the acting geological advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You have full access to our satellite arrays and our deep-sea acoustic nets. Miller, you're her liaison. If she needs a coffee, you get it. If she needs a nuclear submarine to move an inch to get a better reading, you make the call. He stepped closer to her, his face inches from hers. But know this, Captain, if you're wrong, if I shut down the American economy and move 50 million people for a wave that never comes, I won't just end your career. I'll make sure the rest of your life is spent in a cell beneath this mountain. Do you understand? Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the threat, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the water she saw in her mind. I understand, General, but if I'm wrong, you'll have plenty of empty cells to choose from, because the Atlantic will be the only thing left of the East Coast. He nodded once, a sharp military gesture, and walked out of the room to take his call with the president. Elena turned back to the console. Her hands were steady, but the back of her neck was burning. She felt the pressure of the institution around her, the thousands of people in this bunker who were already resenting her presence, the experts who were waiting for her to fail, the system that was designed to move slowly when the world was moving fast. "Ma'am," Miller said, stepping up beside her. He looked like he was about to vomit. "You really think it's going to happen? The wave?" "The physics don't lie, Miller," she said, her eyes scanning a fresh stream of data from a buoy in the mid-Atlantic. "But the people do. We have to find a way to prove it before the politics kill more people than the water." She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was SFC Holloway. He had been flown in on a separate bird, part of the security detail for the witnesses from Montana. He looked battered, his uniform still stained with the mud of the valley, but his eyes were clear. "We're with you, Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Me and the boys from Alpha, we saw what you did on that ridge. We know who you are." "I need more than loyalty, Sergeant," Elena said, her voice tight. "I need the deep-crust data from the SOSUS arrays. The Navy won't give it to a captain. They think it's classified beyond my pay grade." Holloway looked at the room full of officers who were pretending not to watch them. He looked at the general's empty chair. "Then we don't ask them. We find the person who has the keys and we tell them the mountain is coming for them, too." Elena looked at him, and for a second, the isolation she had felt since she was a 12-year-old girl in Wyoming vanished. She wasn't just a scientist in a room full of soldiers. She was a soldier in a world of variables, and she finally had a squad that knew how to hold the line. But the moment of connection was shattered by a sudden, violent lurch of the floor. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a shockwave. A series of alarms began to blare, a high-pitched, rhythmic screaming that signaled a breach. On the main screen, the Virginia seismic station flatlined, then the Maryland station, then the Delaware station. "General," a technician shouted, "we just lost contact with the surface sensors at Site R. We've got a massive ground displacement event occurring right outside the main gate." Elena grabbed the edge of the console as the room bucked again. She looked at her handheld unit. The red lines weren't shivering anymore, they were screaming. "It's not the wave yet," she whispered, her face going pale. "The cascade. It's not just unzipping the faults. It's collapsing the car systems." "What does that mean?" Miller yelled over the alarms. "It means the ground under our feet is hollow," Elena said, her voice trembling for the first time. "And the mountain above us just got too heavy." The sound began then, not a roar, but a deep, grinding groan, the sound of 500 million years of rock finally giving up the ghost. High above them in the tunnels of Raven Rock, the lights flickered and died, replaced by the eerie red glow of the emergency power. Elena looked up at the ceiling, at the thousands of tons of greenstone that were supposed to keep them safe. She didn't see a fortress, she saw a trap. "We have to get out of the bunker," she said, her voice cutting through the panic of the room. "We can't." A colonel shouted, his face illuminated by the red light. "The blast doors are locked. Protocol says we stay put." The protocol was written for a bomb. Elena yelled back, stepping toward him, her eyes burning with a dark, terrifying competence. "A bomb hits the surface. A tectonic collapse hits the foundation. If we stay here, we're not in a bunker. We're in a coffin. General Henderson, look at the pressure readings." Henderson had re-entered the room, his face ashen. He looked at the monitors, which were showing the structural integrity of the outer tunnels dropping to 40%. The mountain was crushing itself. "The main elevators are out," Henderson said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "The emergency stairs are on the north side, but the seismic event is centered there." "Then we go through the utility shafts," Elena said, "the ones that follow the natural fault lines. They're the only parts of the mountain that are already relaxed. They won't collapse like the man-made tunnels." "You want us to crawl through the cracks in the rock while the mountain is falling down?" The colonel gasped. "I want you to live," Elena said. She turned to Miller and Holloway. "Get the gear, everything that can record a signal. We're going to the surface." She looked at Henderson. "General, you have a choice. You can stay here and maintain the chain of command until the mountain finishes its breath, or you can come with me and find a way to tell the president that the wave is still coming." Henderson didn't hesitate. He reached for his sidearm, checked the magazine, and holstered it. "Lead the way, Captain. But if we die in a hole in the ground, I'm going to be very disappointed." Elena didn't smile. She grabbed her seismic unit, checked the battery, and started running toward the back of the command center, toward the small, unmarked door that led to the guts of the mountain. As they burst into the utility corridor, the air was already thick with dust and the smell of ancient pulverized stone. The mountain was speaking again, a low, rhythmic thumping that felt like a giant's heartbeat. Elena led them with a precision that was almost supernatural, her hand grazing the walls, her mind mapping the stress points in the dark. They reached the first utility shaft, a vertical climb of 300 feet. The ladder was cold and slick with condensation. "Miller, you first. Holloway, cover the rear." Elena commanded. They began to climb. Above them, they could hear the grinding of the blast doors, the sound of steel being twisted like tinfoil. Below them, the sounds of the war room, the shouting, the alarms, the frantic typing, grew fainter and fainter, replaced by the absolute, crushing silence of the earth. Halfway up, the shaft shuddered. A shower of small stones rattled off Elena's helmet. She stopped, pressing her body against the rungs, her eyes closed. "Ma'am," Miller's voice came from above, trembling. "Did it stop?" "No," Elena whispered, her hand feeling the vibration in the steel. "It's just getting its grip." She looked down. Henderson was 2 rungs below her, his face a mask of grim determination. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life commanding the world, only to find out that the world didn't take orders. "Keep moving," she said. They emerged into a secondary maintenance level, a long, narrow tunnel that was barely 5 feet high. The air was hot and tasted of sulfur. Elena checked her handheld unit. They were 300 feet below the surface, but the seismic activity was intensifying. "The fault is right here," she said, pointing to a hairline crack in the floor that was leaking a thin, wispy steam. "We have to cross it, carefully." They stepped over the crack one by one. When it was Henderson's turn, the ground shifted. A sharp, loud asterisk crack asterisk echoed through the tunnel, and the fissure widened by 6 inches. Henderson stumbled, his boot slipping into the gap. Elena lunged forward, grabbing him by the harness of his tactical vest and yanking him back just as a jet of superheated steam hissed out of the opening. He looked at her, his chest heaving, his eyes wide. "Thanks," he wheezed. "Don't thank me yet," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the tunnel ahead. "We still have the surface to deal with." They reached the final exit, a heavy steel hatch that led to a disguised ventilation shack on the mountainside. Holloway and Miller threw their weight against the lever, their muscles straining, their faces red with effort. With a screech of protesting metal, the hatch flew open. They scrambled out into the morning air. Raven Rock was gone, not the mountain, but the entrance. The entire side of the ridge had slumped, a massive landslide of greenstone and soil that had buried the main gates, the guard towers, and the landing pad under 50 feet of debris. The forest around them was a graveyard of snapped cedars and uprooted oaks. The air was a thick, gray haze of dust that blotted out the sun. Elena stood on a pile of rubble, looking out over the valley. In the distance, she could see the smoke rising from the towns in the gap. The world was quiet, but it was the silence of a battlefield after the guns have stopped. "General," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the ruins. Henderson climbed up beside her. He looked at the buried fortress, then at the destruction below. He pulled a satellite phone from his pocket. It was dead. "The cascade," he whispered. "It's not just the faults. It's the infrastructure. We're dark." Elena looked at her handheld unit. The signal from the Mid-Atlantic buoy was still coming through, a faint, flickering light in the darkness of the data. "We're not dark yet," she said. "The buoy is still transmitting, and it just recorded a 30-foot rise in the sea level at the Mid-Atlantic ridge." She looked at him, her eyes hard and brilliant. "The wave is born, General, and we have 6 hours to find a way to tell the world." Henderson looked at the ruined mountain, then at the woman who had led him out of it. He saw the gray dust on her face, the blood on her hands, and the absolute, unwavering clarity in her eyes. He realized then that the military, the government, the protocols, they were all just sandcastles. The only thing that was real was the woman standing in front of him, the woman who could hear the world breaking and wasn't afraid of the sound. "How do we get a signal out?" he asked. Elena looked toward the north, where a tall, skeletal tower stood on a distant peak, a high-altitude microwave relay station. "We hike to that tower," she said. "We hotwire the transmitter, and we broadcast on every frequency the military has left." "That's 10 miles of broken terrain," Holloway said, looking at the jagged landscape. "And we have no transport." "Then we start walking," Elena said. She stepped off the rubble and began to move, her boots finding the rhythm of the earth once more. She didn't look back to see if they were following. She knew they were. Because in a world where the mountains were falling and the sea was rising, Elena Vance was the only thing that still had a direction. They moved through the shattered forest like ghosts, their movements silent and purposeful. The ground beneath them continued to shiver, a constant reminder that the earth was still resetting itself. Every few miles they came across signs of the destruction, a collapsed hunting cabin, a road that had been split in half, a stream that was flowing uphill. As they reached a clearing halfway to the relay station, Elena stopped. She held up a hand, her head tilted to the side. "Listen," she whispered. At first there was nothing but the wind. Then a low, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't the earth this time, it was a machine. A black helicopter, unmarked and flying low, crested the ridge. It wasn't a military bird. It was a civilian model modified for high-speed transport. "Is that ours?" Miller asked, a note of hope in his voice. "No," Henderson said, drawing his sidearm. "That's a private contractor, probably searching for someone from the bunker." The helicopter circled the clearing, its searchlight cutting through the dust. It flared and began to descend. As it touched down, 4 men in civilian tactical gear stepped out. They weren't carrying rescue equipment. They were carrying suppressed rifles. "General Henderson," one of them shouted over the roar of the rotors. "We're here to extract you. Orders from the secretary." Henderson didn't move. He looked at the men, then at Elena. "The secretary is in a bunker in Colorado. He doesn't have the authority to send a private bird into a restricted zone during a red sky event." "General, please, we don't have much time. The situation on the coast is deteriorating." The man stepped forward, his rifle at the low ready. He wasn't looking at Henderson. He was looking at Elena. Specifically, he was looking at the lead-lined box she was carrying. "And we'll take the data, Captain, for safekeeping." Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the wind. This wasn't a rescue. This was a sanitization. Someone at the highest levels of the government didn't want the alarmist data to get out. They wanted to control the narrative of the disaster, even if it meant letting millions of people die to protect their own reputations. "The data stays with the mission," Elena said, her voice a whip crack. "Captain, don't make this difficult," the man said, his finger moving toward the trigger. "We have orders to secure the primary geological witness and all associated materials, by any means necessary." Henderson stepped in front of Elena, his silver hair catching the light of the helicopter's strobes. "I am the Deputy Director of the Joint Staff. You are on a military reservation during a national emergency. Drop your weapons or you will be treated as hostile combatants." The man in the tactical gear didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a shot echoed through the clearing. The man's head snapped back and he fell into the dirt. Elena spun around. Holloway was standing behind a fallen cedar, his service pistol smoking. Miller was beside him, holding a piece of heavy equipment like a club. "Hostile it is, sir," Holloway said, his voice as cold as the mountain stone. The clearing erupted into a frantic, close-quarters firefight. The contractors had the superior weapons, but Elena's team had the terrain and the desperation of men who had already looked death in the eye and refused to blink. Elena didn't hide. She stayed low, moving behind the cover of the rubble, her eyes fixed on the helicopter. She saw the pilot trying to lift off, the rotors kicking up a storm of dust and leaves. "The radio!" she yelled to Miller. "Don't let them take the bird." Miller, usually the most cautious of the group, did something Elena would never have expected. He charged. He ran across the open ground, ignoring the bullets that kicked up the dirt around his boots, and threw his heavy seismic spike, a 2-foot rod of hardened steel, into the tail rotor of the helicopter. There was a horrific metallic shriek as the tail rotor shattered. The helicopter spun wildly, its nose dipping into the ground. It lurched and rolled, the main blades snapping against the trees like toothpicks. A second later, the fuel tank ignited, and the clearing was bathed in a brilliant orange light. The remaining contractors, seeing their escape route destroyed, retreated into the woods, disappearing into the haze. Silence returned to the clearing, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of the 4 survivors. Elena walked over to Miller, who was sitting on the ground, staring at his hands. He was covered in soot, and a graze on his shoulder was bleeding through his shirt. That was brave, Miller," she said, kneeling beside him. "I just didn't want to walk 10 miles, ma'am," he whispered, a weak, shaky smile touching his lips. Elena looked at the burning wreck, then at Henderson. He was standing over the body of the lead contractor, looking at a small, encrypted device he had taken from the man's pocket. "The orders didn't come from the secretary," Henderson said, his voice flat. They came from a private server at the Department of Energy, someone who stands to lose a lot of money if the offshore drilling rigs in the Atlantic are shut down for a false alarm. He looked at Elena, his eyes full of a dark, cold rage. They're willing to let the coast drown to protect their quarterly dividends. Elena felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The enemy wasn't just the mountain or the wave. It was the same institutional blindness that had nearly killed her in Montana, now weaponized by greed. "We're not going to the relay station," she said. "Then where?" Holloway asked. "The helicopter," she said, pointing to the burning wreck. "The cockpit is gone, but the long-range comms array in the tail section is separate. If Miller didn't break it, we can use the battery from my seismic unit to power the satellite uplink." They worked through the night, the fire from the helicopter providing the only light in the dark forest. Elena and Miller stripped the wiring from the tail section, their fingers moving with the precision of surgeons. Holloway and Henderson stood guard at the edge of the clearing, their eyes scanning the woods for the returning contractors. At 0300 Zulu, 4 hours before the wave was set to hit, the satellite uplink chirped. "I have a carrier signal," Elena said, her voice trembling with fatigue. "Who are we calling?" Henderson asked. "Everyone," Elena said. "Not just the military, not just the president. We're broadcasting the raw buoy data and the seismic model to every news agency, every weather station, and every ham radio operator on the planet. We're taking the narrative away from them." She hit the transmit button. On her screen, a progress bar began to crawl across the display. 10%, 20%, 30%. "Come on," she whispered. Suddenly, the screen went red. Asterisk uplink interrupted. External override detected. Asterisk, they're jamming us, Miller gasped. "They've got a mobile EW unit in the area." Elena looked toward the ridge. A mile away, a small glowing light was visible, the signal from an electronic warfare truck. "I'll go," Holloway said, checking his magazine. "I can take it out." "No," Elena said, standing up. "You won't get close enough. They'll have a perimeter." She looked at her handheld unit, then at the seismic spike Miller had thrown. A new idea, cold and brilliant, formed in her mind. "General, do you still have that encrypted device you took from the contractor?" "Yes," Henderson said. "Give it to me." She took the device and wired it into her seismic unit. "The EW unit is looking for a satellite signal. It's not looking for a ground wave. I'm going to use the seismic spike to send a low-frequency pulse through the bedrock. It'll bypass their jamming and use the mountain itself as an antenna. It'll hit every seismic sensor in the country." "Can you do that?" Henderson asked. "I can," Elena said, "but it'll burn out the unit, and it'll tell them exactly where we are." "Do it," Henderson said. Elena knelt in the dirt. She took the seismic spike and drove it into a crack in the granite floor of the clearing. She connected the wires, her hands moving with a final, desperate speed. She looked at the data. The wave was now 3 hours away. It was growing. It was now estimated at 120 feet. "Sending," she said. She hit the final key. The seismic unit began to hum, a high-pitched, metallic whine that grew louder and louder. The spike in the ground began to glow with a dull, red heat. For a heartbeat, the earth itself seemed to vibrate with the frequency of the data, the truth of the world's breaking, coded into the very stone of the mountain. Then the unit exploded in a shower of sparks. Elena fell back, her eyes burning. She looked at the screen of her handheld. Asterisk transmission complete. Acknowledgement received. Neek, USKS, NOAA, BBC, CNN. Asterisk, it's out, she whispered. In the distance, the lights of the EW unit flickered and went dark. But then the sound of engines returned. Not one helicopter this time, but 3, and the sound of heavy trucks crashing through the undergrowth. "They're coming," Holloway said, his rifle raised. Henderson looked at Elena. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the way she was slumped against the ruined helicopter. He saw the woman who had saved his life and the lives of millions of people she would never meet. "Captain Vance," he said, his voice soft. "You've done your job, now it's time for me to do mine." He turned to Holloway and Miller. "Get her out of here. There's an old fire trail 2 miles east. It leads to a ranger station. They'll have a vehicle." "General, we're not leaving you," Elena said, trying to stand. "Yes, you are," Henderson said. He looked at the approaching lights. "I'm a lieutenant general of the United States Army. I'm going to stand in the middle of this road, and I'm going to show these people exactly what happens when you try to subvert the chain of command during a national emergency. I'm the only one they can't just sanitize without a trial." He looked at her, and for the first time, Elena saw a flicker of something like fatherly pride in his cold, winter-sea eyes. "Go, Elena. Save the world. I'll hold the mountain." Holloway and Miller grabbed Elena, pulling her toward the woods. She looked back one last time. Henderson was standing in the center of the clearing, his back to the fire, his shadow long and steady against the trees. He looked like a statue, a remnant of an old world that was being swept away, but one that refused to fall. As they disappeared into the dark of the fire trail, the first of the contractor trucks roared into the clearing. Elena didn't look back again. She focused on the ground, on the rhythm of her boots, on the way the earth was still shivering beneath her. She felt the weight of the data she had sent, an invisible wall of truth that was now racing toward the coast, trying to outrun the water. They reached the ranger station just as the first light of dawn touched the sky. It was a small, stone building, miraculously untouched by the slides. A battered Forest Service truck was parked in the front. Holloway hot-wired the truck in seconds. Elena climbed into the passenger seat, her head falling back against the headrest. She was beyond exhaustion. She was a hollow shell held together only by the vibration of the planet. As they drove down the winding mountain road, Miller turned on the radio. The emergency broadcast system was active, repeating the evacuation order for all coastal areas from Florida to Maine. This is not a drill. A mega tsunami event is confirmed. All residents must move at least 20 miles inland or to an elevation of at least 200 feet immediately. Elena closed her eyes. She felt a single hot tear slide down her cheek. They had done it. But then she felt a new vibration. It wasn't a shiver. It was a jolt. The truck swerved as the road beneath them buckled. A massive fissure, 3 feet wide, opened up in the center of the asphalt. Holloway slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from the edge of the chasm. Elena looked out the window. The mountains weren't falling anymore. They were rising. She looked at her handheld unit, which was still flickering with a backup battery. The seismic sensors across the entire continent were recording a vertical displacement of 6 inches per minute. "It's not just a cascade," she whispered, her voice filled with a new, deeper horror. "What is it, ma'am?" Miller asked. Elena looked at the map. She looked at the way the fissures were forming, not along the faults, but in a perfect geometric grid across the heart of the country. "The plate isn't unzipping," she said. "It's delaminating. The crust is separating from the mantle." She looked up at the sky where the sun was now a blood-red disk in the haze. "The wave was just the beginning," she said. "The continent is floating away." As she spoke, a sound like 1,000 freight trains roared through the valley. The ground beneath the truck didn't just shake, it tilted. To the east, the horizon began to sink. To the west, the mountains began to climb toward the stars. Elena Vance sat in the cab of the truck, watching the world tilt on its axis, and realized that the mountain hadn't been the protagonist after all. It had been the warning, and the real story was only just beginning. She reached for the radio, but the signal was gone. She looked at Miller and Holloway, their faces pale in the red light of the dying sun. "We have to get to higher ground," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the end of the world. "Much higher." But as she looked at the GPS, the numbers were spinning in useless, frantic circles. The North American plate was no longer where it was supposed to be. And then she saw it. In the distance, rising over the crest of the sinking horizon, was a wall of white water so high it blotted out the clouds. The wave had arrived. And it wasn't 100 feet high. It was 1,000. Elena Vance gripped the dashboard, her eyes wide and unblinking as the ocean began to swallow the sky. The glass in the Forest Service truck's windshield didn't shatter when the pressure wave hit the valley. It simply turned into a fine, crystalline powder that Elena Vance inhaled as the world was erased by a wall of salt and pulverized cedar. One second, she was looking at a road that no longer led anywhere, and the next, the truck was being lifted by a fist of water so massive, it defied the physics of fluid dynamics. It wasn't a wave like one would see at the Jersey shore. It was a vertical horizon, a mountain of displaced Atlantic that had swallowed the Piedmont and was now hungry for the Blue Ridge. The truck spun, the heavy steel frame groaning as it was tossed into the canopy of oaks that were being snapped like dry pasta. Elena didn't scream. She didn't have the air for it. She felt the sudden, sickening weightlessness of the vehicle being swept into the surge, and she did the only thing her training allowed. She reached for the seismic unit, tucking it into the hollow of her stomach and bracing her boots against the dashboard. The cab filled with a freezing, brackish slurry and heartbeats. Beside her, Corporal Miller was a blur of frantic motion, his hands clawing at the door handle until Holloway reached across and pinned him against the seat. Holloway's face was a mask of cold, tactical focus, his eyes meeting Elena's through the swirling debris. He didn't say to hang on. He didn't say they were going to die. He just held the corporal down so the boy wouldn't drown himself in a panic before the truck hit the ridgeline. The impact came not as a crash, but as a grinding halt. The truck wedged into a cleft of ancient greenstone, the metal shrieking as it was compressed by the weight of the water. Then, the silence of the deep took over. They were underwater, buried in the cabin of a truck wedged into a mountain, and the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the seismic unit's backup alarm, a tiny digital heartbeat in the dark. Elena opened her eyes. The water was dark and thick with silt, but she could see the faint glow of the dashboard lights flickering out. She felt the pressure in her sinuses, a sharp, stabbing pain that told her they were at least 40 feet down. She didn't think about the millions of people who had just been erased. She didn't think about General Henderson standing alone in the clearing. She thought about the frequency. Even through the roar of the water and the crushing pressure, she could feel it. A low 0, 5 hertz thrumming in the rock beneath the truck. The delamination was accelerating. The crust wasn't just sliding, it was vibrating at a pitch that would eventually liquefy the very stone they were wedged into. She had to move. She reached for the emergency glass breaker clipped to her vest, a small, tungsten-tipped hammer. She struck the side window, the sound a dull asterisk thud asterisk in the water. Nothing. The pressure outside was too great. She looked at Holloway. He was already working on the seal of the windshield, using his combat knife to pry at the rubber gasket. He looked at her, pointed to his lungs, and then to the glass. Asterisk one breath. Asterisk Elena nodded. She grabbed the strap of the seismic unit, looping it 3 times around her wrist. She kicked the windshield with both boots, adding her strength to the pressure of the water. The glass gave way all at once, a jagged sheet of safety glass folding inward. The Atlantic Ocean rushed in to claim the remaining air. Elena was propelled out of the cab, her shoulder catching on the steering wheel, a flare of white-hot pain blooming in her joint. She ignored it. She kicked upward, her lungs burning with the sudden, icy cold of the water. The surge was turbulent, a washing machine of trees, pieces of houses, and the bloated carcasses of livestock. She broke the surface and was immediately slapped down by a cresting swell. When she came up a second time, she saw Holloway. He was holding onto a floating roof section, his other hand gripping Miller by the collar of his tactical vest. Miller was coughing, his eyes wide and vacant, the look of a man who had seen the end of the world and was still trying to find the beginning of it. "Vance!" Holloway roared over the sound of the rushing water. The sound was like a continuous explosion. The water wasn't stationary. It was a river the size of a state, flowing inland with the momentum of a planet's shift. They were being carried west, toward the higher peaks of the George Washington National Forest. Elena swam toward them, her movements precise despite the freezing cold and the dead weight of the equipment on her wrist. She reached the roof section and hauled herself up. Her hands were raw, the skin scrubbed away by the grit in the water, but she didn't feel it. She looked at the seismic unit. The screen was cracked, but the green light was still blinking. The internal accelerometer was recording a tilt of 3 degrees every 10 minutes. The North American plate was tilting like a sinking ship. "We have to get to the watchman," Elena said, her voice sounding strange and small in the vast, roaring landscape. She pointed to a peak that was still visible through the haze, a jagged tooth of rock that rose above the tree line. "It's a primary anchor point. The basement rock there is deep. If the plate delaminates, that peak will be the last thing to go unstable." "We're 2 miles out and the water is rising faster than we can swim," Holloway said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "And we're not alone." Elena followed his gaze. A few hundred yards away, another group of survivors was clinging to a cluster of uprooted hemlocks. They weren't soldiers. They were civilians, a family by the look of it, their faces pale and terrified. But behind them, something else was moving. A large, dark shape in the water, navigating the debris with a purpose that wasn't random. It was a Coast Guard response boat small, its twin outboards screaming as the pilot tried to keep it from being swamped by the larger debris. It was marked with the symbols of the same private contractor that had attacked them at the bunker. "They're looking for us," Miller whispered, his voice shaking. "Even now, even with the whole world drowning, they're still coming." "They're not looking for us," Elena said, her eyes narrowing as she watched the boat. "They're looking for the data. They think if they can destroy the record of the delamination, they can claim the disaster was a localized volcanic event. They can keep their insurance, their contracts, their power. They don't realize there won't be a world left to spend the money in." The boat spotted them. The pilot pivoted the craft, the bow cutting through the chop. A man stood in the well of the boat, a rifle in his hands. He didn't fire immediately. The water was too rough for a steady shot. But he was coming. Into the trees, Elena commanded. The roof section was drifting toward a stand of ancient, high-altitude pines that were still holding against the surge. They slid into the water, using the floating debris as shields. The water was shallower here, the tops of the trees only a few feet below the surface. Elena felt the branches clawing at her legs, pulling at her boots. She didn't fight them. She used them, pulling herself through the canopy like a macabre version of a jungle gym. She could hear the boat's engines getting closer, the whine of the outboards a predatory snarl in the mist. "There," she whispered, pointing to a rock outcropping that broke the surface like a jagged island. They scrambled onto the rock, the greenstone slick with moss and salt. Elena immediately knelt, pressing her ear to the stone. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowing, her entire being narrowing down to the vibration. The others watched her, Holloway keeping his pistol trained on the approaching boat, Miller shivering in the cold. To anyone else, the mountain was a solid, unmoving thing. To Elena, it was a living, screaming entity. She could hear the internal fractures spreading like ice on a pond. She could feel the slip face of the mountain. "The boat is going to hit a pressure ridge," she said, her eyes still closed. 10 seconds. "Miller, get down. Holloway, don't fire." "What are you talking about?" Holloway asked, but he lowered his weapon. Countless hours of studying the hidden geometry of the Appalachians had given Elena a capability that felt like prophecy but was actually just the highest form of observation. She didn't see the water, she saw the energy moving through it. She saw the way the surge was being funneled by the submerged valleys, creating a standing wave of immense pressure directly in the boat's path. 7, 8, 9. The Coast Guard boat hit the invisible wall of water. The bow didn't rise. It was hammered down by a sudden, violent surge from beneath. The boat pitch-poled, the engines screaming as the props left the water before the entire craft was crumpled against a submerged granite ledge. There was no explosion, just the sound of tearing metal and the sudden silence of a silenced engine. The men on the boat were gone in an instant, swallowed by the same indifferent force they had tried to exploit. "How did you know that was there?" Miller asked, his voice filled with a new kind of awe. "I didn't know," Elena said, standing up and wiping the salt from her eyes. "I heard it. The water makes a different sound when it hits a compression point. If you listen to the harmonics, you can see the shape of the bottom." She didn't wait for them to process it. She looked toward the watchman. The peak was closer now, but the water was still rising. The 1,000-foot surge was beginning to level out, but the secondary waves, the echoes of the continental tilt, were just starting to arrive. "We have to climb," she said. The trek up the side of the watchman was a descent into a nightmare. The mountain was shedding its skin. Every few minutes, a section of the forest would simply slide away, the soil liquefied by the seismic vibration. They had to navigate a landscape that was literally falling apart beneath their feet. Elena led the way, not by following the trails, but by following the bone structure of the mountain. She stepped only where the rock was anchored into the deep crust, avoiding the loose shale and the unstable mud. At one point, the ground beneath Miller gave way. He didn't even have time to yell. He just started to slide toward a 500-foot drop into the churning Atlantic. Holloway lunged for him, but the mud was too slick. Miller was sliding, his fingers clawing at the earth, his face a mask of pure, primal terror. "Stop!" Elena yelled. She didn't move toward him. She moved away toward a large, weathered boulder that looked like it was about to roll. She threw her weight against a small, wedge-shaped stone at the boulder's base, kicking it free. The boulder shifted, sliding 3 inches and jamming into a fissure. The shift in weight was tiny, but it was enough to redirect the flow of the mud. The slide beneath Miller slowed, the energy diverted by the new tension point Elena had created. Holloway grabbed Miller's hand and hauled him back to solid ground. They stood there, gasping, looking at Elena. She was already looking back at the peak, her face tight, her hands gripping the seismic unit so hard her knuckles were white. "The mountain is tired, Elena," Holloway said, using her name for the first time. "You can't keep it standing by yourself." "I'm not keeping it standing," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum. "I'm just asking it to hold on for another hour. We have to get the sensor to the summit. If I can't get a reading on the deep crust delamination from a stable anchor point, we won't know if the plate is going to flip or just settle. If it flips, there's no coming back, not for anyone." "Who are you?" Miller whispered, looking at her as if she were a ghost. "No one can do what you're doing. No one can see the world like that." "I'm a captain in the United States Army," she said, her eyes flashing with a brief, controlled fire. "And I have a mission. Keep moving." They reached the 3,000-foot mark as the sun began to set. The sky was a bruised, terrifying purple, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and salt. The Atlantic had turned the interior of the United States into a new, violent sea. From their vantage point, they could see the tops of the higher peaks of the Blue Ridge, islands in a dark, churning ocean. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the roar of the water and the grinding of the earth. At the summit of the Watchman, there was a small, automated weather station and a fire lookout tower. The tower was made of reinforced steel, anchored deep into the granite. It was still standing, though it was leaning at a precarious angle. "Miller, get to the weather station. See if the satellite uplink is still pinging. Holloway, secure the perimeter." Those contractors might have had a second bird. Elena walked to the edge of the summit. She knelt, placing the seismic unit on the bare rock. She connected the external probes, driving the steel spikes into the granite with a heavy mallet she took from her pack. She didn't look at the horizon. She looked at the data. The numbers were catastrophic. The North American plate had detached from the asthenosphere along a 3,000-mile front. It was currently riding on a cushion of superheated gas and liquid mantle. It was drifting west at a rate of 4 miles per hour. But it wasn't just drifting, it was rotating. The southern end of the plate was sinking while the northern end was lifting. "The tipping point," she whispered. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Holloway. He was looking at the screen, though she knew he couldn't understand the complexity of the waveforms. He understood the look on her face, though. "How long?" he asked. "If we don't find a way to vent the pressure under the plate, it's going to capsize," Elena said. "The weight of the Atlantic on the east coast is pushing the edge down. It's like a person standing on the edge of a raft. Eventually, the raft flips. Can we vent it?" Elena looked toward the south, where the horizon was glowing with a dull, subterranean red. "The New Madrid Fault. It's the weakest point in the center of the plate. If we can trigger a controlled release of the trapped gas there, it might settle the plate. It would be the largest earthquake in human history, but it would stop the flip." "And how do we trigger an earthquake?" Miller asked, coming over from the weather station. "The uplink is dead, by the way. The satellites are still there, but the ground stations in Virginia and Maryland are gone." Elena stood up, her frame silhouetted against the red sky. She looked at the seismic unit, then at the fire tower. "We don't need a satellite. We need a signal, a big one." She turned to Holloway. "General Henderson mentioned a red sky protocol. There's a secondary command and control facility at Mount Weather. It's only 50 miles from here. It has a deep-crust acoustic transmitter, Project ELF. It was designed to communicate with submarines at the bottom of the ocean using low-frequency waves. If I can get to that transmitter, I can send a harmonic pulse to the New Madrid. I can use the Earth's own internal pressure against it." 50 miles of water and collapsing mountains," Holloway said, his voice flat. "And we don't have a boat." "We don't need a boat," Elena said, pointing to the base of the fire tower. Attached to the side of the lookout station was a small orange pod, an emergency evacuation glider, a high-tech version of a wingsuit designed for Forest Service jumpers. There were 3 of them. "You're kidding," Miller said, looking at the sheer drop from the summit. "The wind is blowing at 60 knots toward the southwest," Elena said, her eyes calculating the glide slope. "The thermal lift from the plate friction will keep us aloft. We can make Mount Weather in 40 minutes. "I've never used a wingsuit, ma'am," Miller said, his face going pale again. "Then you're going to learn very quickly, Corporal," Elena said. She didn't offer comfort, she offered a harness. They suited up in silence. The wind was screaming now, a high-pitched howl that made the fire tower vibrate. Elena checked Holloway's straps, then Miller's. She didn't let herself think about the impossibility of what they were about to do. She thought about the math, the weight of the air, the angle of the descent, the frequency of the Earth. She was no longer a person. She was a variable in a global equation, and she was the only one that hadn't been solved yet. "On my mark," she said, standing at the edge of the railing. The world below them was a churning abyss of dark water and broken stone. The red glow from the south was getting brighter, reflecting off the underside of the clouds like a glimpse into hell. 3, 2, 1, mark. They jumped. The transition from the solid rock to the screaming air was a shock that nearly knocked the wind out of Elena's lungs. She spread her arms and legs, the fabric of the suit snapping taut. The lift was incredible. The air was hot and dense, rising from the fractured earth like a physical hand. She looked to her left and right. Holloway was steady, his military parachute training allowing him to find the glide path with ease. Miller was tumbling, his suit flapping wildly. "Miller, arch your back, look at the horizon." Elena shouted into her radio. Slowly, the corporal stabilized. They were flying through a world that didn't look like Earth anymore. They passed over valleys that were now bays, over ridges that were now islands. They saw the remnants of the old world. A water tower sticking out of the surge, the lights of a single, doomed plane circling endlessly in the dark. The cost of the flight was the silence. In the air, away from the grinding of the rock, the scale of the disaster finally hit home. Elena felt the weight of it, a cold, crushing grief that threatened to break her concentration. Every town she knew, every person she had ever met on the East Coast was gone. Her parents in Wyoming, were they safe? The delamination was continental. The Rockies would be shivering now. The desert would be opening up. She shoved the thought down. Grief was a luxury for the survivors. She was still on the clock. Mount Weather at 11 o'clock. Holloway's voice crackled in her ear. The facility was visible as a series of reinforced bunkers and antenna arrays on a high ridge. It was still above the waterline, but the ground around it was crisscrossed with massive fissures. As they approached, Elena saw something that made her heart stop. A fleet of helicopters was circled around the main entrance. Not rescue birds, combat helos, Black Hawks and Apaches, their rotors spinning, their door guns manned. "They're not ours," Holloway said. "Those are the contractors. They must have relocated from Raven Rock before the collapse. They've taken Mount Weather. They are trying to secure the only remaining deep-crust transmitter," Elena said, her voice turning to ice. "They want to be the ones who decide which parts of the country are saved and which ones are sacrificed." "We can't land at the main gate," Miller said. "They'll cut us out of the sky." "The ventilation shafts," Elena said. "They are on the north slope. If we can drop the suits and slide into the intake, we can get into the lower levels without going through the perimeter." It was a suicidal maneuver. The shafts were narrow and the fans were still spinning, their roar audible even from the air. Elena adjusted her pitch, diving toward the mountainside. She saw the concrete square of the intake, a dark hole in the side of the ridge. "Release suits! Now!" She pulled the quick release. The fabric fell away and she was falling, a human stone. She tucked her head, her boots hitting the metal grating of the intake with a bone-jarring impact. She rolled, grabbing the edge of the frame as Holloway and Miller landed beside her. They were inside. The interior of Mount Weather was different from Raven Rock. It was older, more industrial, a labyrinth of rusted pipes and humming generators. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and old grease. They moved through the service tunnels, their footsteps echoing on the metal gratings. "The Project ELF transmitter is on level 6, Elena said, checking a map she had memorized years ago. "It's a shielded room near the core. We have to get there before they figure out we're in the system." They reached the stairwell and began to descend. Every floor they passed was a scene of chaos. They saw staff members being herded into rooms by armed men in civilian tactical gear. They saw the remnants of the legitimate government, colonels and administrators being held at gunpoint. Elena didn't stop. She couldn't. "We have to help them," Miller whispered, looking through a glass door at a group of terrified technicians. "We help them by saving the plate, Miller," Elena said, her voice hard. "If we stop for them, we all drown. Move." They reached level 6. The hallway was guarded by 2 men with suppressed rifles. Holloway didn't wait for instructions. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a Tier 1 operator. He was behind the first guard before the man could even turn his head. A sharp, efficient movement and the guard went down. The second guard turned, his rifle coming up, but Holloway was already there, his combat knife finding the gap in the man's vest. It was over in 3 seconds. No shots fired. No alarms. "Get to the console," Holloway said, his chest heaving. "I'll hold the door." Elena and Miller burst into the transmitter room. It was a massive chamber dominated by a series of glowing blue tubes, the acoustic amplifiers. At the center was a circular console with a single, large touchscreen. Elena's fingers flew across the interface. She didn't need the manual. She knew the language of the machine because she knew the language of the Earth. She began to input the coordinates for the New Madrid. She calculated the harmonic resonance, the exact frequency that would cause the trapped gas pockets to vent without shattering the entire plate. "I need more power," she said. "The primary generators are being diverted to the surface defenses." "I can reroute it from the life support," Miller said, his hands shaking as he pulled a panel from the wall. "But the people in the upper levels, they'll lose air." Elena paused. She looked at the screen at the map of the United States. She saw the millions of lives hanging in the balance. She saw the face of the technician she had seen through the door. "Do it," she said, her voice a whisper. We don't have a choice. Miller pulled the lever, the lights in the room dimmed, and the blue tubes began to glow with a blinding intensity. The floor began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that felt like it was rattling the teeth in Elena's head. "Signal locked," she said, "beginning the pulse." The screen showed a graphic of a wave traveling through the crust. It was moving at 5,000 miles per hour, a spear of acoustic energy aimed at the heart of the continent. Suddenly, the door to the chamber blew inward. A flashbang grenade detonated, filling the room with white light and a deafening roar. Elena was thrown back, her ears ringing, her vision a blur of dancing spots. She tried to reach for the console, but a heavy boot stepped on her hand. "That's enough, Captain," a voice said. Elena looked up. It was the man from the clearing, the leader of the contractors. He was covered in soot and blood, his face a mask of twisted rage. He had a bandage around his head, and one of his eyes was swollen shut. He held a pistol to Elena's head. "You've been a very difficult woman to kill," he said. Behind him, Holloway was being held by 3 other men, his face bruised, his weapon gone. Miller was huddled in the corner, a rifle pointed at his chest. "Shut it down," the contractor commanded. "Now, or I'll start with the boy." Elena looked at Miller, then at the console. The pulse was at 40%. It needed 60 more to trigger the release. "If I shut it down, the plate flips," she said, her voice steady despite the gun at her temple. "You'll die along with everyone else. There is no safe bunker for what's coming." "I have a flight planned for the Azores," the man said, a delusional gleam in his eye. "We'll be in the air before the tilt reaches 45 degrees. We have the data, we have the resources. We'll build a new world, but we don't need a witness who can prove we knew about the delamination before the surge." "The Azores are gone," Elena said, her voice cold and certain. "The Atlantic surge didn't just hit the East Coast. It started in the Canary Islands. The Azores were the first things to go under. You're flying to a graveyard." The man hesitated, the gun wavering for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening she needed. Elena didn't reach for her weapon. She reached for the console. She didn't hit cancel. She hit overload. The blue tubes in the room didn't just glow, they screamed. The acoustic energy, instead of being directed into the crust, was reflected back into the chamber. The vibration was so intense that the glass in the monitors shattered. The men in the room dropped their weapons, clutching their ears, their noses beginning to bleed from the sheer pressure of the sound. Elena felt the vibration in her very bones. It felt like her marrow was boiling. She stayed on her knees, her eyes fixed on the progress bar. 50%, 55, 60, asterisk transmission complete. Asterisk deep beneath the surface of the Earth, 1,000 miles away, the New Madrid fault didn't just slip. It exploded. A massive plume of trapped gas, compressed for millions of years, found the path Elena had created. It vented into the atmosphere with the force of 10,000 nuclear bombs. The Earth groaned, a sound that was heard as far away as California. The plate, which had been tilting toward the abyss, shuddered and began to settle. In the transmitter room, the overload reached its peak. The blue tubes shattered and the room was plunged into darkness. Silence followed, a thick, heavy silence that felt like the end of time. Elena lay on the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She felt a hand on her arm. It was Holloway. He was pulling her up, his face a blur in the emergency red lights. Is it over?" Miller's voice came from the darkness, sounding like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. Elena looked at her handheld unit. It was dead, the screen shattered by the overload, but she didn't need it. She could feel the Earth. The vibration had changed. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was a low, steady thrum. The delamination had stopped. The plate was anchored. She looked around the room. The contractors were gone, vanished into the chaos of the facility. The man who had held the gun to her head was slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and vacant, his eardrums shattered by the pulse. "We have to get to the surface," Elena said, her voice raspy and broken. They climbed through the ruins of Mount Weather. The facility was a wreck, the structural integrity compromised by the seismic pulse they had triggered. They emerged into the morning light. The world was unrecognizable. The Blue Ridge Mountains were now a series of jagged cliffs overlooking a vast, gray ocean. The forest was gone, replaced by a wasteland of mud and debris. The sky was a pale, sickly yellow, the sun a dim orb behind a thick layer of ash and steam. But the water was receding. The surge had reached its peak and was now flowing back into the Atlantic basin. The continent had survived. Elena stood on the edge of the ridge, looking out over the new world. She felt a profound, hollow emptiness. She had saved the plate, but she had lost the world she knew. Every city, every landmark, every history book, it was all underwater. "Ma'am," Miller said, stepping up beside her. He was holding a small, battery-powered radio he had scavenged from the facility. "I'm getting a signal." He turned up the volume. "This is the United States Emergency Management Agency. If you are hearing this, stay where you are. We are coordinating rescue efforts from the Omaha bunker. The tectonic stability has been restored. I repeat, the Earth is stable. Help is coming." Elena listened to the voice, a thin, fragile thread of hope in the silence. She looked at her hands. They were scarred, burned, and caked in the dust of a dying world. She looked at Holloway, who was standing a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He looked at her and gave a single, sharp nod. The bond between them was beyond words, a connection forged in the fires of a global extinction event. "What now?" Miller asked. Elena looked toward the west, where the sun was beginning to burn through the haze. "Now," she said, her voice gaining a new, steady strength, "we find the others, we find the people who survived the night, and we start rebuilding." She felt the weight of the seismic unit on her wrist. It was a useless piece of plastic and wire now, but she didn't throw it away. It was a reminder of the cost, of the secret capability she had hidden for so long, and the terrible price the world had paid for her to finally use it. The immediate aftermath was a surreal blur. Within hours, the first of the rescue helicopters appeared, legitimate military birds, their crews looking down at the transformed landscape with a horror they couldn't hide. They landed at the summit, the rotors kicking up the gray ash. A colonel stepped out of the first bird, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos. He looked at Elena, at her battered uniform and her bloodied hands. He looked at the ruined facility of Mount Weather. "Captain Elena Vance?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said, standing straight, her heels together. "General Henderson sent us," the colonel said. "He survived the slide at Raven Rock. He's in Omaha now. He told the president that if we're still standing, it's because of a geologist who wouldn't stop climbing. He offered her a hand. The world wants to know what happened, Captain, and they want to know what we do next." Elena looked at the hand, then at the horizon. She saw the first green shoots of a tree breaking through the mud near the intake. She saw the ocean, calm now, reflecting the pale light of the new sun. She didn't take the hand. She walked past the colonel and climbed into the helicopter. "What we do next, Colonel," she said, her voice echoing in the cabin, "is we listen. We listen to the Earth, because next time we might not be so lucky." As the helicopter lifted off, Elena Vance looked down at the broken ridge of Mount Weather. She felt the vibration of the engines, a man-made frequency that was small and insignificant compared to the roar of the planet. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't try to hear the fractures. She just listened to the silence. The institutional reckoning hadn't arrived yet. The court-martials, the investigations, the political fallout, it was all waiting for her in the bunkers of Nebraska. She knew she would be blamed by some and hailed by others. She knew she would never be just a geologist again. But as the bird turned west, flying over the new coastline of the American interior, Elena felt a small, quiet spark of hope. The mountain had fallen, the sea had risen, and the world had broken. But she was still standing, and for now, that was enough. She reached out and took Miller's hand, his fingers still shaking. She squeezed it once, a firm, grounding pressure. "We're going home, Miller," she whispered. "Home?" he asked, looking at the water below. "Ma'am, there is no home left." Elena looked at the horizon, at the vast, empty space where the world used to be. "Home is where we start building," she said. The helicopter disappeared into the haze, a tiny black dot against the scale of the new Atlantic. Below them, the earth remained silent, the great plates settled into their new, uneasy peace. The crisis had passed, but the world was forever changed. And in the shadow of the watchman, the first waves of a new history were just beginning to wash against the shore. Elena leaned her head against the vibrating glass of the window. She was tired. She was broken. But as the sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the jagged peaks of the new Appalachian archipelago, she realized she was exactly where she was meant to be. She was the witness. She was the architect of the survival. And as long as she could hear the earth, she knew they would never be lost again. The immediate aftermath was quiet, but the reckoning was coming. Elena Vance knew it. She could feel it in the air, a different kind of tension, a social and political vibration that would be just as dangerous as the tectonic one. But that was for tomorrow. Today, she just wanted to watch the sun rise over the ocean that used to be her country. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the rotors take her. She was a soldier. She was a scientist. She was the woman who had heard the world break and stayed to fix the pieces. And as the helicopter sped toward the west, she finally let herself fall into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she had known since the mountain in Montana had started to scream. The air inside the Offutt underground complex tasted like ozone and recycled sweat, a sterile contrast to the salt-heavy rot Elena had breathed for the last 48 hours. She sat on the edge of a narrow cot in room 402, her hands resting palm-up on her thighs, watching the way the fluorescent lights caught the silver-gray scarring where the ELF console had tried to fuse her skin to the copper housing. The room was small, windowless, and painted a shade of beige that felt like a deliberate insult to the vibrant, terrifying world she had just left behind. There was no clock on the wall, only the steady, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system, a 60 hertz vibration that scratched at the back of her skull like a dull needle. To anyone else, it was background noise. To Elena, it was a constant reminder that the earth was still there, beneath the concrete and the lead shielding, and that it was no longer the same earth she had known a week ago. She had been in isolation for 14 hours since the Black Hawk had touched down on the tarmac in Nebraska. They had taken her gear, her seismic unit, and her mudded BDUs, replacing them with a stiff, oversized set of hospital scrubs that smelled of industrial bleach. They hadn't called it a detention, but the Air Force security detail standing outside the door didn't move when she approached the threshold to ask for water. They simply looked through her with the hollowed-out eyes of men who had spent the last 2 days watching satellite feeds of the Atlantic Ocean swallowing the cities where their families lived. The institution was processing her, grinding through the data of her actions the way a combine harvester grinds through wheat, indifferent to the grain so long as the yield was recorded. A soft chime echoed in the room as the heavy steel door hissed open. Elena didn't stand. She didn't look up until the shadow of the man entering crossed her boots. It wasn't the colonel from the mountain. It was a man she had never seen before, wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than her annual salary, and carrying a tablet that glowed with a pale, unforgiving light. Behind him stood a brigadier general she recognized from the briefings at Raven Rock. General Vance, no relation, a man who had built a career on the smooth transition of assets. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, his skin sagging against his jawline, his eyes bloodshot and watery. "Captain Vance," the man in the suit said. His voice was Midwestern, flat, and practiced. "I'm Undersecretary Miller. This is General Vance. We'd like to thank you for your service during the transition." "Transition," Elena said. The word felt like lead in her mouth. She looked at the Undersecretary, her eyes narrowing. "Is that what we're calling the erasure of the Eastern Seaboard now? A transition?" The Undersecretary didn't flinch. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat opposite her, his movements precise. "We are in the process of defining the narrative. The stability of the remaining 40 states depends on a clear, unified understanding of the events. Panic is a secondary surge, Captain, one we cannot afford." The plate settled. Elena said, her voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate with the room's ventilation. "The new Madrid vent worked. The delamination stopped at the 85th meridian. You have a continent left because I triggered that pulse. Why am I in a holding cell?" General Vance stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial belt, a gesture of habit that felt absurd in the cramped room. "You're not in a cell, Elena. You're in protective custody. There are legal complexities. You utilized a classified strategic asset, the ELF transmitter, without authorization. You triggered a seismic event that caused catastrophic damage to the infrastructure of 6 states that were otherwise untouched by the surge. St. Louis is a field of rubble. Memphis is gone. The casualty estimates from the earthquake alone are in the hundreds of thousands. And the casualty estimates if the plate had flipped?" Elena asked. She stood up then, her movements slow and deliberate, ignoring the flare of pain in her scarred hands. She walked to the wall, pressing her palm against the cold concrete. She could feel the deep crust echo of the New Madrid settling, a slow, tectonic sigh. 100 million, every person east of the Mississippi and most of those to the west. I traded the few to save the many. That's the math we're taught at West Point, isn't it, General? The math is different when you're the one who pulls the trigger, the Undersecretary said, tapping his tablet. The Department of Justice is looking at the Red Sky Protocol. They are asking why a junior officer was in a position to make a God-level decision. They're asking about the contractors you engaged. They're asking why the data from your seismic unit was encrypted with a key that we don't have. Elena turned her head, looking at them over her shoulder. I didn't encrypt it. The unit was designed to auto-lock if it detected a continental-scale delamination. It's a fail-safe to keep the data out of the hands of people who would use it to short the global markets before the water even hit the shore. People like the men who tried to kill me at Mount Weather. The room went silent. The undersecretary looked at the general. It was a look Elena had seen 1,000 times in the field. The look of men realizing the variable they were trying to solve was actually the one holding the chalk. The contractors, General Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. We're characterizing them as a rogue element, a private security firm that overstepped its mandate during the chaos of the initial surge. They were using Coast Guard assets, Elena said. They had the frequency for the Raven Rock bunker. They were part of the institution's own shadow, General. Don't lie to me, not after what I've seen. The undersecretary stood up, his face hardening. What you've seen is a world in collapse, Captain. What you're going to see now is how we put it back together. We need that encryption key. We need a full, sworn statement that the New Madrid Pulse was a malfunction of the ELF system during the surge, not a deliberate act. We can't have the American public knowing that their government chose to sacrifice the Midwest to save the West. It would start a civil war in the middle of a literal apocalypse. You want me to lie, Elena said. It wasn't a question. I want you to be a hero, the undersecretary said. The woman who survived the mountain, the witness who saw the tragedy and lived to tell the tale. We'll give you the Distinguished Service Cross. We'll give you a promotion to major. We'll give you a life in the new capital in Denver that most people would kill for. All you have to do is sign the statement. And if I don't? General Vance looked away, his eyes fixed on the beige wall. Then the legal complexities become much more personal. The Red Sky Protocol has no provision for unauthorized use. You'd be looking at a court-martial for war crimes. Mass casualty events caused by unauthorized military action. They'll bury you so deep in Leavenworth you'll forget what the sun looks like. Elena felt a cold, familiar calm settle over her. It was the same feeling she'd had when the water was rushing into the truck, the narrowing of the world down to a single, solvable problem. She looked at her hands, the silver scars pulsing in time with the bunker's heart. I want to see Corporal Miller, she said, and Master Sergeant Halloway. I want to see them now. They're being debriefed, the undersecretary said. They're being given the same choice, Captain. I'd suggest you think about their futures as much as your own. If you go down, they go with you. They were your accomplices in the destruction of federal property. The door hissed open again, and the two men left without another word. Elena was alone with the hum of the ventilation and the weight of 100 million ghosts. She sat back down on the cot, closing her eyes. She didn't think about Denver. She didn't think about Leavenworth. She thought about the sound the earth made when it finally settled, that low, resonant asterisk thrum asterisk that only she could hear. It was the sound of truth, and it didn't care about narratives or undersecretaries. An hour later, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the men in suits. It was a single Air Force MP, a young woman with a face like a porcelain doll and a grip like a vise. She didn't speak. She just gestured for Elena to follow. They moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the Offutt bunker, passing through layers of security that grew more intense the deeper they went. They passed the war room, a massive amphitheater where hundreds of officers were staring at a giant screen. Elena stopped for a fraction of a second, her breath catching in her throat. The map of the United States was gone. In its place was a new geography. The entire East Coast from Maine down to the tip of Florida was blue. The water reached as far inland as the Appalachian Trail, creating a 1,000-mile-long bay. The Mississippi River was no longer a river. It was a wide, jagged scar of brown and gray where the earth had opened up, a new sea cutting the country in half. The new Atlantic and the inland sea. Half the flags on the map were gone. The cities she knew, New York, D.C., Atlanta, Chicago, were just coordinates under the tide. The MP nudged her and they continued down to level 9. The air here was colder, smelling of damp earth and old brass. They stopped in front of a heavy iron door with a reinforced glass slit. Inside, sitting at a metal table, was Corporal Miller. He looked smaller than he had on the mountain. His shoulders were slumped, his face buried in his hands. There was a tray of untouched MREs on the table beside him. Elena watched him through the glass for a long moment, seeing the way his fingers trembled, a fine, high-frequency vibration that spoke of a nervous system pushed past the breaking point. The MP swiped a card and the door opened. Miller looked up, his eyes widening when he saw her. He scrambled to his feet, knocking the tray of food to the floor. "Captain, ma'am," Are you okay? Elena walked into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. She didn't hug him. She didn't offer a platitude. She just stood in front of him, her presence a solid, unmoving anchor. I'm fine, Miller. Sit down. He sat, his knees knocking against the metal table. They told me we killed them. They told me the earthquake was our fault. They said the gas vent at the New Madrid killed everyone in the evacuation camps. They showed me pictures, ma'am, the children, the families. Elena leaned forward, her voice a sharp, disciplined blade. Miller, look at me. He looked, his eyes wet and searching. They are trying to break your sense of reality so they can replace it with theirs, she said. The gas vent was necessary. Without it, the entire plate would have capsized. Those people in the camps would have been at the bottom of a 2,000-foot ocean. Do you understand? We didn't kill them. We gave the rest of the world a chance to live. The cost was terrible, but it was the only trade on the table. But they said we could have waited, that the data was wrong, that you miscalculated. I don't miscalculate the Earth, Miller, she said, and for a second the hidden capability flared in her eyes, a look of such absolute, terrifying certainty that Miller actually recoiled. I heard it, I felt the delamination. The data was a formality. The truth was in the rock. Don't let them take that from you. You were there, you saw the water, you felt the mountain slide, you know what was coming. Miller wiped his face with his sleeve, a ragged, desperate motion. They want me to sign a statement saying you were unstable, that you were suffering from acute stress and that I followed your orders because I was afraid of you. Elena felt a sharp pang of anger, but she kept her face a mask of iron. And what did you tell them? I told them to go to hell, Miller whispered. But then they showed me Holloway. He's in the infirmary, Captain. They said he might not make it. They said his internal injuries from the flight, the vibration from the ELF. His lungs are failing. Elena's heart skipped a beat, the first crack in her armor. Holloway, where? Level 2. Intensive care, Miller said. He wouldn't sign either. He told them that if they wanted to talk about unauthorized action, they should start with the men who were shooting at us in the bunker. He's still fighting them, ma'am, even now. Elena stood up, her mind racing. The institution was moving faster than she'd expected. They weren't just trying to bury the story. They were trying to isolate the witnesses and pick them off one by one. If Holloway died and Miller broke, she was nothing more than a rogue officer with a delusional story. Stay strong, Miller, she said, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. The heat from her skin seemed to transfer to him, a jolt of steady, military-grade resolve. Don't sign anything, no matter what they show you, no matter what they promise. Do you hear me? Yes, ma'am, Miller said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. The MP opened the door, her eyes fixed on the far wall. Elena walked out, her mind narrowing to a single objective. She didn't return to her room. She waited until they reached the elevator, and then she turned to the MP. Take me to the infirmary, she said. I have orders to return you to room 402, Captain, the woman said, her hand moving toward her holster. Your orders are based on the assumption that I'm a prisoner, Elena said, stepping into the MP's personal space. She didn't use force. She used the weight of her rank and the terrifying quiet of her presence. I am still a commissioned officer in the United States Army. I have not been charged. I have not been relieved of duty, and my master sergeant is dying on level 2. You can follow your orders and explain to the general why you used force on a DSC nominee, or you can take me to see my man. Your choice, Airman. The MP hesitated, the conflict visible in the set of her jaw. She looked at Elena's scarred hands, then at the fire in her eyes. Slowly, she reached out and pressed the button for level 2. The infirmary at Offutt was a high-tech tomb. The walls were lined with monitors displaying the vitals of the survivors, the high-ranking officials and essential personnel who had made it into the bunker before the doors closed. The air smelled of antiseptic and burnt oxygen. Elena moved through the ward, her boots clicking on the linoleum, her eyes searching for the one face that mattered. She found him in a private room at the end of the hall, guarded by 2 more MPs. They stepped aside when they saw her escort, though they looked uneasy. Holloway was hooked up to a ventilator, his chest rising and falling with a mechanical, rhythmic wheeze. His skin was the color of old parchment, and there were dark bruises around his eyes. He looked like a man who had been put through a rock crusher and then asked to run a marathon, but even in the drug-induced haze, his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Elena walked to the bedside. She didn't look at the monitors. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold, the pulse weak and thready. She closed her eyes, letting her own internal rhythm slow down, seeking the vibration of his life force. Asterisk thump, 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 asterisk, it was there, faint but stubborn, the same stubbornness that had kept him on that roof section in the middle of the Atlantic, the same stubbornness that had led him into the ventilation shafts of Mount Weather. "Holloway," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "It's Vance. Can you hear me?" His eyelids flickered. A long, slow breath escaped the ventilator. His fingers twitched against her palm, a weak Morse code tap. Asterisk S, T, A, Y, asterisk, "I'm staying," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "We're both staying. They're trying to bury us, Holloway. They're trying to turn the world into a lie, but the earth doesn't lie. The water doesn't lie. We're the only ones who know where the bodies are buried. You have to keep breathing. Do you hear me? That's an order." The monitor spiked, a sudden sharp rise in his heart rate. His eyes opened, just a sliver of blue visible through the haze. He looked at her, and for a second the fog cleared. He saw her. He saw the scars on her hands. He saw the scrub suit. And then he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Captain Vance." The voice came from the doorway. It was General Vance again, but this time he was alone. He looked at Holloway, then at Elena, his expression unreadable. "I told them you'd come here," he said. He walked into the room, his boots silent on the floor. "You always were predictable in your loyalties, Elena. It's what made you a good soldier. It's what's making you a liability now." "He's dying because of what we did," Elena said, not letting go of Holloway's hand. "He's dying because he believed in the mission, and you're in here talking about liabilities." The general sighed, a long, weary sound. He walked to the window, a digital screen displaying a live feed of the Omaha skyline. The city was a sea of tents, thousands of refugees huddling in the shadow of the bunker. "The institution is a living thing, Elena. It has an immune system. When something threatens its survival, be it a tectonic shift or a captain with a conscience, it reacts. The undersecretary is the white blood cell. He's trying to dissolve you so the rest of the body can live." "And you?" Elena asked. "What are you, General?" "I'm the one who has to live with the map," he said, turning back to her. "I was the one who signed the orders for the evacuation camps in Missouri. I knew the New Madrid was a risk. I knew the ELF pulse would trigger it, and I authorized you to go to Mount Weather anyway." Elena froze. "You knew?" "I knew it was the only way," he said, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "The delamination was terminal. We had the same data you did, Elena, but we couldn't go public with it. We couldn't be the ones to pull the trigger. We needed a rogue element. We needed someone who would do the impossible and take the blame for the consequences." The weight of the betrayal hit Elena like a physical blow. She let go of Holloway's hand, her own hands beginning to shake. "You sent us there to be your scapegoats. You knew I'd see the frequency. You knew I wouldn't be able to look away. You used my capability against me." "I used your excellence," the general corrected. "I knew you were the only person in the army who could find the New Madrid's harmonic. I knew you were the only one who wouldn't hesitate when the choice was between 6 states and 40, and I was right. You saved the country, Elena, but the country can never know that it was saved by a deliberate act of destruction." "So now what?" Elena asked, her voice turning to ice. "You let the undersecretary bury us. You let Holloway die in this room while you play the grieving patriot." The general walked toward her, stopping only inches away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. He held it out to her. "This is the raw data from Hangar 7, he said. "The telemetry from the Atlantic surge, the contractor's flight plans, and the audio logs from your transmission. It proves the delamination was a natural event, and that the contractors were working for a shell company owned by the same people who are currently advising the undersecretary." Elena looked at the drive, then at him. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because the immune system is starting to attack me, too," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "They're going to retire me next week. They'll give me a medal and a quiet house in Virginia, what's left of it. They want me gone because I know the truth as well as you do, but I'm an old man, Elena. I've spent my life protecting the institution. I don't have the strength to tear it down." "But I do," she said. "Yes," he said, "you do, but there's a cost. If you use this, you'll never have that life in Denver. You'll never be a major. You'll be a fugitive in a world that's mostly water. You'll be the woman who destroyed the American narrative at the moment it was most fragile." Elena took the drive, her fingers closing over the cold metal. She looked at Holloway, whose breathing was steadying, the color slowly returning to his cheeks. She looked at the scars on her hands, the mark of the earth. "The narrative is a lie, General," she said. "The earth is the only thing that's real, and it's time people started listening to it." "The undersecretary has a press conference in 2 hours," the general said, checking his watch. "He's going to announce the red sky findings. He's going to name you as the primary cause of the Midwest disaster." Once he says it on the national broadcast, it becomes the truth. You have 2 hours to get to the uplink in the communications center on level 4. Why help me now? Elena asked. The general looked at Holloway, then back at her. Because I'm tired of being a white blood cell, Captain, and because someone needs to tell the families in Missouri the truth. He turned and walked out of the room, his head held high, his gait the steady, rhythmic march of a soldier who had finally found his way back to the mission. Elena stood alone in the silence of the infirmary. She looked at the thumb drive, then at Holloway. She felt the vibration of the bunker, the deep, industrial thrum of a machine that was built to survive the end of the world. She knew what she had to do. She knew what it would cost. She knew that from this moment on, she was no longer a soldier of the United States Army. She was a soldier of the truth. She leaned over and kissed Holloway's forehead, a soft, fleeting moment of human warmth in the cold metal room. "I'll be back for you," she whispered. "Keep the rhythm." She turned and walked toward the door. The MPs didn't stop her. They didn't even look at her. They were too busy watching the monitors, watching the map of their dying world, waiting for someone to tell them what to believe next. Elena moved through the corridors with the quiet, predatory grace she had learned in the mountains. She avoided the main elevators, using the service stairs and the maintenance tunnels. She knew the layout of the bunker from the emergency blueprints she'd memorized during her first hour in isolation. She was a ghost in the machine, a variable that the undersecretary hadn't accounted for. She reached level 4, the communications hub. This was the heart of the Offutt bunker, the place where the signals from the remaining satellites were collected and broadcast to the rest of the world. It was a high-security zone, guarded by a squad of elite MPs in full tactical gear. Elena didn't have a weapon. She didn't have a clearance. All she had was a thumb drive and the capability to see the world as it really was. She stopped at the corner of the hallway, pressing her back against the cool steel. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the hub wash over her. She heard the click of the keyboards, the low murmur of the technicians, the hum of the servers. And then she heard it, the frequency. The communications hub was built on a fault line, a small, minor fracture in the Nebraska granite that the engineers had deemed stable. To Elena, it was a weakness, a pressure point. She looked at the ceiling, seeing the way the heavy conduit pipes were anchored into the rock. She saw the tension in the bolts, the way the vibration of the servers was creating a standing wave in the floor. She didn't need a flashbang. She didn't need a rifle. She walked to a fire suppression panel on the wall. She opened it, pulling out a heavy steel wrench. She walked to the main support pillar of the hallway, a massive column of reinforced concrete that looked immovable. She knelt at the base of the pillar, pressing her ear to the stone. She waited. She felt the rhythmic pulse of the bunker's generators, the 60 hertz hum that was the heartbeat of the institution. She timed it. Asterisk 1, 2, 3. Asterisk she struck the pillar with the wrench. Not a hard blow, but a precise one. A strike at the exact harmonic frequency of the granite. The sound was a dull asterisk clink asterisk, but the effect was instantaneous. A hairline fracture appeared in the concrete, spreading upward like a spiderweb. The floor beneath her feet shuddered, a localized seismic event that was no larger than a foot across. But it was enough. The vibration traveled through the pillar, into the ceiling, and into the conduit pipes. A series of bolts sheared off, the metal screaming as the pipes shifted. A cloud of dust and acoustic insulation fell from the ceiling, triggering the smoke detectors. The alarms began to wail, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that cut through the bunker's calm. The heavy blast doors of the communications hub began to slide shut, part of the automated fire protocol. The MPs in the hallway panicked, their training taking over as they moved to secure the perimeter. They didn't see the woman in the gray hospital scrubs slipping through the closing doors of the server room. Elena was inside. The server room was a forest of black towers, the air freezing and loud with the roar of cooling fans. At the center was the main uplink console, the gateway to the world. She sat down, her fingers flying across the keys. She didn't have the login, but she had the thumb drive. She plugged it in and the system began to pulse. Asterisk access denied. Asterisk access denied. Asterisk access denied. Asterisk she didn't stop. She looked at the code, seeing the patterns, the frequencies of the encryption. She began to input a series of commands that shouldn't have worked, commands based on the seismic geometry of the data itself. She wasn't hacking the computer, she was harmonizing with it. The screen flickered. The red text turned green. Asterisk access granted. Asterisk Elena took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She looked at the files on the drive. The telemetry, the recordings, the truth. She opened the national broadcast channel. On the main monitor, she saw the undersecretary. He was standing on a podium in the bunker's briefing room, his face illuminated by the glare of the television cameras. He looked calm, authoritative, the face of a man who was about to save the world with a lie. "And so, it is with a heavy heart that we must report the cause of the Midwest disaster," the undersecretary was saying. "Initial investigations suggest that Captain Elena Vance, acting under extreme psychological duress, intentionally overloaded the ELF system at Mount Weather. This unauthorized action triggered the New Madrid event, causing the deaths of—" Elena hit the override button. The undersecretary's face on the screen was suddenly replaced by a graph, a jagged, pulsing line of seismic data. Above it, in bold white letters, were the words, asterisk, asterisk, the truth of the delamination. Asterisk, asterisk, then the audio began to play. It wasn't Elena's voice. It was the voice of the contractor from the mountain, his words clear and damning. "We have the data, we have the resources, we'll build a new world, but we don't need a witness who can prove we knew about the delamination before the surge." Then the telemetry, the proof that the Atlantic plate had been sliding for weeks before the first wave hit. The proof that the government had known and had chosen to save itself while the people on the coast were left to drown. Elena watched the monitor. She saw the undersecretary's face go pale. She saw him look at the camera, his eyes wide with a sudden primal terror. He knew. He knew the machine had turned on him. In the server room, the door was being hammered on. The MPs were trying to break through the blast lock. Elena didn't move. She stayed at the console, watching the data flow out into the world. She saw the signal being picked up by the emergency stations in Denver, in Omaha, in the tents outside the bunker. She saw the lie crumbling in real time. But then the screen went black. The power to the server room was cut. The roar of the fans died away, replaced by a sudden, oppressive silence. The only light was the red emergency glow of the backup batteries. The door to the room finally gave way, and the MPs burst in, their rifles leveled at her chest. "Step away from the console," they roared. Elena stood up, her hands raised. She wasn't afraid. She felt a profound, hollow sense of completion. The data was out. The frequency had been broadcast. The world might still be broken, but it was no longer a secret. "Captain Elena Vance," a voice said from the back of the room. The undersecretary walked through the door. He wasn't pale anymore. He was flushed with a dark, boiling rage. He walked up to her, his hand trembling as he pointed a finger at her face. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed. "You've started a revolution in the middle of a graveyard. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I told the truth," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. "The rest is up to them." "There is no them," the undersecretary screamed. "There is only the institution, and you just burned it to the ground." He turned to the MPs. "Take her, put her in the hole. No visitors, no lawyers, no one speaks to her. She doesn't exist anymore. Do you understand? Elena Vance died at Mount Weather." The MPs moved forward, grabbing her arms. They hauled her out of the server room through the dark corridors of the Level 4 hub. Elena didn't resist. She didn't say a word. She just watched the shadows on the wall, her mind fixed on the image of Holloway's flickering eyelids. They took her to Level 10, the deep detention. This was the place where the people who didn't exist were kept. The air was thick and heavy, the silence absolute. They threw her into a cell that was nothing more than a concrete box with a steel door. No cot, no light, just the cold, indifferent stone. The door slammed shut and the lock turned. Elena sat on the floor, her back against the wall. She closed her eyes. She felt the vibration of the earth, the deep, ancient rhythm of the planet that had survived 5 extinctions and was currently mid-stride in its 6th. She felt the weight of the water above her, the billions of tons of Atlantic that were now resting on the bones of her country. She was alone. She was a ghost. She was a war criminal, but as she sat there in the dark, she realized she could still hear it. The frequency. It was faint, but it was there, a low, resonant asterisk thrum asterisk that was coming from the other side of the wall. She reached out, her fingers touching the concrete. She felt the vibration. It wasn't the bunker. It wasn't the generators. It was a voice. "Captain," the sound was coming from the ventilation shaft, a tiny metallic echo. "Captain Vance, can you hear me?" Elena leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Miller." "It's me, ma'am," the voice whispered. "I'm in the maintenance crawlspace, Holloway. He's with me. We got him out of the infirmary during the blackout, the general. He left the service elevator unlocked." "Is he okay?" Elena asked, her voice a desperate rasp. "He's breathing, Captain. He's weak, but he's here. We're at the level 10 service hatch. We have the codes for your door, but we have to move now. The Undersecretary is moving the command staff to Denver. They're going to seal this bunker in 20 minutes. Elena stood up, her fingers clawing at the steel door. How did you find me?" "We didn't find you, Captain," Miller said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "We just followed the sound. You hit that pillar on level 4. The whole bunker is still ringing like a bell. You left us a trail." The lock on the door clicked. The heavy steel hissed open. Elena stepped out into the hallway. Miller was there, his face covered in soot, a heavy crowbar in his hand. Beside him, leaning against the wall, was Holloway. He was pale and gaunt, his hospital gown stained with blood, but his eyes were clear. He was holding a suppressed pistol he had clearly taken from a guard. "Captain," Holloway said, his voice a ragged shadow of itself. "Master Sergeant," Elena said, her eyes stinging. "The general says there's a transport plane waiting on the auxiliary strip," Miller said, looking down the hallway. "A C-130 that's not on the manifest. We have 10 minutes to get to the surface before the security lockdown." "Where are we going?" Elena asked. Holloway looked at her, a grim, knowing light in his eyes. He looked at the scars on her hands, then at the concrete walls of the bunker that was meant to be their tomb. "The general says the Missouri Valley is opening up," Holloway said. "The people in the camps." They heard the broadcast. They know what happened. "They're looking for a leader, Captain, someone who knows the terrain, someone who can hear what's coming next." Elena looked at the two men, the corporal who had seen her clearly when no one else would, and the sergeant who had stayed when staying cost him everything. She felt the vibration of the earth beneath her boots, the new, violent heartbeat of a world that had been reborn in salt and fire. "Then let's go," she said. They moved toward the service elevator, 3 ghosts in a dying machine. The institution was collapsing, the narrative was burning, and the world was mostly water. But as the elevator began to rise, Elena Vance felt a sudden, fierce surge of hope. She wasn't just a geologist anymore. She wasn't just a soldier. She was the frequency, and the world was finally listening. They reached the surface just as the sun was beginning to set over the Nebraska plains. The sky was a bruised, terrifying purple, the air thick with the smell of the new sea. In the distance, the lights of the Omaha tents were glowing like a field of fallen stars. Elena stood on the tarmac, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked at the C-130 waiting at the end of the runway, its engines screaming into the dark. She looked at the horizon where the new coastline met the sky. She knew the cost. She knew the struggle that was coming. She knew that the institution would never stop hunting her. But as she stepped onto the ramp of the plane, Elena Vance didn't look back. She looked forward into the dark, into the water, into the unknown. The door closed, the engines roared, and the last witness of the old world took flight into the first night of the new one. The C-130 Hercules groaned as it banked hard over the dark silhouette of what used to be the Missouri-Nebraska border. Its 4 Allison T-56 turboprop engines screaming a mechanical defiance against the heavy, humid air of the new interior coast. Elena sat strapped into a red nylon jump seat, her spine pressed against the vibrating fuselage, feeling every shudder of the airframe as if it were an extension of her own nervous system. The flight deck was dimmed to a tactical red, casting long, bloody shadows across the cargo hold. Miller was hunched over a ruggedized laptop a few feet away, his face pale in the glow of the screen, while Holloway lay on a stretcher nearby, his breathing assisted by a portable oxygen concentrator that wheezed in time with the plane's own rhythmic pulse. The air inside the hold smelled of hydraulic fluid, unwashed skin, and the sharp, metallic tang of the ionized air they had brought with them from the bunker. Elena closed her eyes, trying to shut out the noise, but the silence she sought wasn't there. Beneath the roar of the engines, beneath the whistling of the wind against the rivets, she could still feel the earth. It was a low-frequency growl that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her marrow. The New Madrid fault wasn't sleeping. It was settling, like a giant shifting its weight in a shallow grave. The crust beneath them was fractured, wet, and heavy with the weight of the encroaching Atlantic. She could feel the way the water was pressing into the new fissures, the thermal expansion of the deep rock, and the slow, agonizing grind of the North American plate trying to find a new equilibrium. It was a symphony of destruction that only she could hear, a private broadcast from the planet itself, telling her that the maps in the Offutt bunker were already obsolete. "Captain," Miller shouted over the engine noise, gesturing to his screen. I'm picking up localized broadcasts from the Ozark Plateau. They're repeating your data. The signal from Offutt hit the emergency bands before they cut the power. People are talking, ma'am. They're calling it the Vance transmission. Elena didn't open her eyes. It's not my transmission, Miller. It's the truth. The frequency belongs to the rock. The Undersecretary's office is already labeling it a deep fake, Miller said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. They're telling the Denver hub that you're a domestic insurgent using stolen Coast Guard encryption. They've authorized the first space wing to track this tail number. We're not just fugitives, Captain. We're targets. Let them track us, Elena said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried over the roar of the T-56s. The sky is full of ash and water vapor. Their satellites are looking for a world that doesn't exist anymore. By the time they find us, we'll be on the ground. She stood up, her movements fluid despite the turbulence, and walked over to Holloway. The master sergeant looked smaller than he had 48 hours ago. The pressure of the ELF pulse had done more than just damage his lungs. It had rattled the very cohesion of his cells. His skin was translucent, showing the map of his veins like blue rivers on a topographical chart. When she took his hand, his grip was weak, but his eyes were focused. He was a man who had lived his entire life by the book, by the chain of command, by the sanctity of the institution. Now he was an outlaw flying into a storm with a woman the world called a monster. "Where are we?" "Putting down." Holloway rasped, the oxygen mask fogging with every word. "Fort Leonard Wood," Elena said. "The general said the 5th Engineer Battalion is still holding the high ground. They have the seismic sensors we need to monitor the secondary vents. They're the only ones left with the gear to stabilize the Ozark Shelf. They'll have orders to arrest us." Holloway coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Elena's chest ache. "They have orders to survive," Elena corrected. "And right now I'm the only person who can tell them where the ground is going to hold and where it's going to turn into a liquid." The plane dipped suddenly, a violent downdraft that sent a crate of medical supplies sliding across the floor. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding strained. "Captain, we've got a visual on the Missouri coastline, or what's left of it. It's a mess down there. Fires everywhere. I'm seeing massive structural failure on the I-44 corridor. I need a heading for the approach. The GPS is jumping 10 meters every 5 seconds. Elena walked toward the flight deck, her boots finding the rhythm of the plane's vibration. She stepped into the cockpit, where the 2 Air Force pilots were fighting the controls. Through the windscreen, the world was a nightmare of fire and water. The moon was a pale, sickly disk behind a veil of volcanic ash, casting a ghost light over a landscape that no longer made sense. To the east, where the fertile plains of the Missouri Boothiel should have been, there was only a vast, shimmering expanse of dark water. The inland sea had moved faster than the models predicted. It was a jagged, hungry bay that reached toward the Ozarks, swallowing towns and highways in a slow-motion catastrophe. "Give me the yoke," Elena said. The pilot, a major with a sweat-stained flight suit, looked at her as if she were insane. "Ma'am, I'm flying a 150,000-pound aircraft in a hurricane of tectonic ash. I don't care who you are, you're not a pilot." "I'm not looking at the air," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm looking at the gravity. The mass of the water is pulling the air down. You're fighting a pressure differential caused by the crustal collapse. If you stay on this heading, you're going to stall in the lee of the sinking plate." She reached out and put her hand on the center pedestal. She didn't touch the controls, but she closed her eyes, letting her mind expand past the cockpit, past the metal skin of the C-130 and into the churning atmosphere. She could feel the density of the air changing as the earth below shifted. There was a pocket of stability over the Mark Twain National Forest, a pillar of cool, rising air where the granite of the Ozark uplift was still holding firm. 20 degrees to the left," she commanded. "Drop to 3,000 feet. Follow the heat signature of the granite, not the GPS." The major hesitated, then looked at his co-pilot. The instruments were spinning, a chaotic dance of red and yellow warnings. He gritted his teeth and kicked the rudder, banking the heavy plane into the dark. The turbulence eased almost instantly. The screaming of the wind dropped to a low hum. The plane felt suddenly lighter, as if it had found a hidden path through the sky. "How the hell did you know that?" the major whispered, his hands shaking on the yoke. "The earth doesn't just move under your feet," Elena said, her voice flat. "It moves the world above it. You just have to know how to listen." They spiraled down toward the darkness of Fort Leonard Wood. The base was a flickering island of emergency lights in a sea of shadow. As they descended, Elena could see the silhouettes of thousands of vehicles, cars, trucks, Humvees, jammed into the perimeter of the base. It was a city of the damned, a concentrated mass of human desperation clinging to the last piece of high ground in the Midwest. The landing was a brutal, jarring affair. The runway at Leonard Wood had been buckled by the tremors, and the C-130 bounced like a stone on water before the pilot slammed the thrust reversers home. The roar was deafening, the cabin filling with the smell of burning rubber and hot brakes. When the plane finally came to a halt, the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was a silence filled with the weight of 100,000 people waiting for a miracle. The cargo ramp lowered with a mechanical whine, letting in the air of the outside world. It was cold, smelling of wet earth, pine needles, and the faint, sulphurous stench of the deep vents. Elena stepped out onto the ramp, Miller and the pilots following with Holloway's stretcher. A wall of flashlights hit them instantly. Dozens of National Guardsmen and Army MPs were waiting at the edge of the tarmac, their rifles raised, their faces hidden behind gas masks. A man in a mud-spattered ACU uniform stepped forward, his silver oak leaves catching the light. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed, commander of the 5th Engineer Battalion. Elena had met him once at a conference in Rolla. He was a man who understood the math of the earth, but the look in his eyes now was one of a man who had seen the math fail. "Captain Vance," Reed said, his voice amplified by a bullhorn. "You are under orders from the Department of Defense to surrender yourself and your party immediately. You are being charged with high treason and the unauthorized destruction of federal infrastructure." Elena didn't raise her hands. She stood on the ramp, her gray hospital scrubs flapping in the wind, her scarred hands visible in the light. She looked at Reed, then past him, at the sea of tents and the thousands of people shivering in the dark. "The infrastructure was already gone, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying without the need for a bullhorn. "The delamination is continuing. The St. Francois Mountains are going to see a magnitude 7 event within the next 6 hours. If you don't move these people to the north ridge of the plateau, they'll be buried in the liquefaction of the valley floor." "The Denver hub says you're lying," Reed shouted. "They say the new Madrid is stable. They say you triggered a gas pocket at Mount Weather to cover your own tracks." "Look at the water, Marcus," Elena said, pointing toward the dark horizon where the inland sea was visible as a shimmering line of death. "Does that look like a gas pocket to you? Does that look like stability? I sent you the raw data. I know you saw it. I know you ran the numbers." Reed hesitated, his rifle dipping slightly. The men around him shifted uneasily. They were soldiers, but they were also Missourians. They had families in those tents. They had felt the ground move beneath their boots for 3 days straight. They knew the difference between a political narrative and the terrifying reality of the earth breaking. "The general, Vance, he said you'd come," Reed said, his voice dropping. "He said you were the only one who could see the pattern. The general is a patriot who chose the truth over the institution," Elena said. "And right now I need your help. My master sergeant is dying. My corporal has the telemetry from the ELF pulse, and the earth is about to scream. Are you going to arrest me, or are you going to help me save these people?" Reed looked at the MP sergeant next to him, then back at Elena. He lowered his bullhorn. "Lower your weapons," he commanded. "Get that stretcher to the medevac center, and get the captain to the command post. Now." The next 4 hours were a blur of dark competence. Elena was moved to the base's underground bunker, not a luxury facility like Offutt, but a functional, concrete-walled command center filled with the smell of stale coffee and maps. She didn't wash. She didn't eat. She sat at a table with Reed and his staff, her scarred hands tracing the fault lines on a topographical map of the Ozarks. Miller was in the corner, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he integrated the telemetry from the C-130 with the base's local seismic grid. They were building a real-time model of the crustal collapse, a digital picture of a world in the process of becoming something else. "The pressure is building here," Elena said, her finger resting on a point near Eminence, Missouri. "The water is lubricating the current river fault. It's a secondary slip. When it goes, it's going to trigger a slide that will take out the entire southern approach to the base." "That's where the Red Cross has the field hospital," Reed said, his face turning gray. 2,000 beds. We can't move them in time." "You don't have to move them," Elena said. "You have to vent the pressure. There's a natural gas line that runs through the valley. If you blow the relief valves at these 3 coordinates, you'll create a controlled collapse. It'll drop the valley floor by 10 feet, but it'll lock the granite plates before they can slide. It'll save the hospital." "That's $1 million of infrastructure," a young captain said, his voice trembling. "The company that owns that line. The company that owns that line is currently 600 feet underwater in New Orleans," Elena said, her eyes narrowing. "Do it, Reed, now." Reed didn't hesitate this time. He barked orders into a radio, sending out teams of engineers with demolition charges. Elena sat back, her eyes closing. She could feel the teams moving. She could feel the vibration of their trucks on the road. And she could feel the earth waiting, the massive, coiled energy of the Ozark uplift ready to strike. 10 minutes later, the ground shook. It wasn't the slow, grinding tremor of a tectonic shift, but the sharp, percussive blast of the gas line venting. Through the monitors in the command center, Elena watched as the valley floor near Eminence slumped, a massive section of earth dropping away like a trapdoor. The slide began, a wall of mud and rock moving toward the hospital, but it slowed, then stopped as it hit the new depression. The granite plates locked with a sound that vibrated through the bunker's floor, a deep, resonant asterisk thud asterisk that signaled a temporary peace. "It worked," Reed whispered, staring at the screen. "You saved them." "We bought them time," Elena said. "That's all the Earth ever gives us." She stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She walked out of the command center, ignoring the stares of the officers. She needed to see Holloway. She found him in a small room in the base hospital, a brick building that had survived the tremors with only a few cracks in the plaster. He was awake, though his face was obscured by an oxygen tent. Miller was sitting in a chair by the bed, his head lolling in sleep, the laptop still open on his knees. Elena walked to the bedside, her boots silent on the linoleum. She looked at Holloway, the man who had been her anchor through the storm. He had lost his career, his health, and the institution he loved, all because he had chosen to believe in her. He saw her and reached out, his hand trembling. She took it, the silver scars on her palm pressing against his skin. "The transmission?" he asked, his voice a faint rasp. "It's everywhere," Elena said. "The Denver hub is trying to suppress it, but the National Guard units in the Midwest are starting to ignore their orders. People are realizing the truth, Holloway. They're realizing that the world didn't just end. It changed, and they have a right to know why." Holloway closed his eyes, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "Good, we did the mission." "We did the mission," Elena echoed. She stayed with him until he fell into a deep, natural sleep, his breathing finally finding a steady rhythm. Then she walked out into the corridor. She found Miller still asleep in the chair, his face looking younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. She gently took the laptop from his lap and set it on the floor, then covered him with a thin hospital blanket. She walked out of the hospital and onto the grounds of the base. The sun was beginning to rise, a pale, watery light breaking through the ash clouds. The air was cold and crisp, the first breath of a new world. Elena walked toward the edge of the plateau, where a chain-link fence separated the base from the wilderness of the Ozarks. She stood there for a long time, looking out over the landscape. To the south, the inland sea was a vast, silver mirror, reflecting the bruised colors of the dawn. The world was broken, jagged, and terrifying. Millions were dead, and millions more were displaced, living in tents and waiting for a government that no longer had the power to save them. The institution she had served was a hollow shell, a collection of men in suits trying to manage a catastrophe they couldn't even understand. But as she stood there, Elena Vance felt something she hadn't felt since the first tremor hit the mountain. She felt a connection, not just to the earth, but to the people. She felt the weight of their lives, the fragility of their hope, and the absolute necessity of the truth. She realized that her hidden capability, her ability to hear the earth, wasn't a curse. It wasn't a tool for the military or a secret to be guarded by the institution. It was a bridge. She was the one who could lead them through the transition. She was the one who could tell them where the ground was safe, where the water would stop, and how to build a new world on the ruins of the old one. The cost had been everything. Her name, her rank, her safety, her peace of mind. She was a woman who would never be able to walk into a room without hearing the ghosts of the 100 million she couldn't save. She was a woman who would always be hunted by the men who wanted to turn the earth back into a lie. But she also knew something now that she hadn't known in part one. She knew that loyalty wasn't to a flag or a chain of command. Loyalty was to the truth of the moment, to the person standing next to you in the storm, and to the ground beneath your feet. A movement to her left caught her eye. She turned and saw a young girl, no more than 6 or 7, standing a few feet away. The girl was wearing a dirty pink coat and holding a ragged teddy bear. She looked at Elena with eyes that were too old for her face, eyes that had seen the world wash away. "Is the ground going to move again?" The girl asked, her voice small and trembling. Elena knelt, the gravel of the plateau crunching beneath her knees. She reached out and touched the girl's shoulder, her hand steady and warm. She closed her eyes for a second, listening to the deep, resonant asterisk thrum asterisk of the granite beneath them. It was steady, it was solid, it was holding. "Not here," Elena said, her voice a low, comforting hum. "The ground here is strong, it's going to keep you safe." The girl looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. She reached out and touched the silver scars on Elena's hand, her small fingers tracing the lines of the Earth's mark. "Did the ground do that to you?" "The ground gave me a gift," Elena said. "It told me the truth, and now I'm going to tell it to you." The girl smiled, a tiny, flickering light in the gray dawn. She turned and ran back toward the tents, her teddy bear bouncing against her leg. Elena watched her go, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She stood up and turned back toward the base. She saw Reed walking toward her, his face grim but determined. He was carrying a radio, the static crackling in the cold air. "Captain," he said, "we've got a signal from the Denver hub, the undersecretary himself. He wants to talk to you." Elena took the radio from his hand. She looked at the horizon, at the new sea and the old mountains, and then she pressed the button. "This is Vance," she said. "Captain," the undersecretary's voice came through the static, sounding thin and desperate. "We're prepared to offer you a full pardon. We'll restore your rank. We'll give you whatever you want. Just tell the people the broadcast was a mistake. Tell them the government is in control." Elena looked at her hands, the silver scars glowing in the morning light. She looked at the thousands of tents, the smoke of the morning fires rising into the ash-filled sky. She thought about Holloway's breathing and Miller's loyalty and the general's sacrifice. "The government isn't in control, Miller," she said, her voice like iron. "The Earth is, and the people are starting to realize that the only thing you have left is a story. But the story is over. The transition has happened. You're a dead woman, Vance," the undersecretary hissed. "We'll find you, we'll erase you from history." "You can't erase the ground, Miller," Elena said. "And you can't erase the frequency. I'm staying here, with the people you abandoned, and if you want to find me, just listen for the sound of the truth. It's the only thing that's still ringing." She handed the radio back to Reed. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. He didn't ask her for orders. He didn't ask her for a plan. He just stood there, a soldier waiting for the next mission. "What now, Captain?" he asked. "Now we build," Elena said. She walked back toward the hospital, her boots finding the rhythm of the earth. She had a corporal to wake up, a sergeant to heal, and a world to lead. She was no longer a soldier of the United States Army. She was a daughter of the Ozarks, a sister to the refugees, and the guardian of the new interior. The hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks. The world continued to shift, the inland sea finding its new boundaries, the climate of the continent changing as the volcanic ash settled into the atmosphere. The Red Sky Protocol was officially disbanded, replaced by a chaotic, decentralized network of survivor communities that communicated via shortwave radio and shared the data Elena provided. The undersecretary and his staff remained in their bunker in Denver, a government in exile that no one listened to anymore. They sent drones to track her, but the drones were lost in the magnetic interference of the new faults. They sent teams to arrest her, but the teams found themselves welcomed into the camps, where the truth was more valuable than a paycheck. Elena became a myth, a shadow that moved through the camps, telling people where to plant their crops and where to build their homes. She never wore a uniform again, but she never lost the discipline of the woman she had been. She was emotionally controlled, her pain kept in the quiet spaces of the night, her loyalty to the mission absolute. Holloway recovered, his lungs scarred but functional. He became the commander of the new Missouri Guard, a force that protected the refugees from the marauders and the desperate. Miller became the architect of the new communication network, a system that used the Earth's own frequencies to transmit data across the broken continent. They were a family, forged in the fire of the Atlantic surge and the cold of the Offutt bunker. They were the ones who had seen the end of the world and decided that it was just a new beginning. In the late autumn, when the first real snow began to fall over the Ozark Plateau, Elena walked out to the edge of the North Ridge. The world was white and silent, the ash finally buried under a blanket of pure, cold lace. The inland sea was a dark, frozen expanse to the south, the jagged peaks of the new islands rising from the ice like the teeth of a giant. She sat on a fallen pine log, her hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy wool coat. She closed her eyes and let her mind sink into the earth. It was quiet. The plates had found their equilibrium. The New Madrid was silent, a deep, heavy slumber that would last for centuries. The continent was stable. She felt a presence behind her and didn't need to turn to know who it was. Holloway stood a few feet away, his breath misting in the cold air. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his presence a solid, unmoving anchor. "It's quiet," Elena said. "It's been a long time coming," Holloway replied. "They're calling this the New America," Elena said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I think they're wrong. It's just America, the way it was always meant to be, hard, real, and built on the truth." "We did okay, Captain," Holloway said. "We did the mission, Sergeant," Elena said. She stood up and looked at him. He looked old, his hair turned white by the stress of the last year, his face a map of the costs they had paid. But his eyes were clear and his back was straight. He was a soldier who had found his way home. "Let's go back," Elena said. "Miller's trying to get the shortwave to reach the Pacific coast. He needs your help with the antenna." They walked back toward the camp, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. They passed the tents, which were now being replaced by sturdy log cabins. They passed the fires, where families were cooking their morning meals. They passed the children who were playing in the snow, their laughter a sound that the earth had forgotten for a long time. Elena stopped at the door of her cabin, a small one-room structure built of local oak and cedar. She looked at the scars on her hands, then at the world she had helped to save. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a martyr. She was just a woman who had heard a sound and refused to look away. She stepped inside, the warmth of the wood stove greeting her. She sat down at a small table and picked up a piece of charcoal, beginning to sketch a map of the new coastline for the schools in the camp. She didn't look back at the bunker, or the mountain, or the sea. She looked at the paper, and she looked at the future. The world was mostly water, and the narrative was a memory, but the ground beneath her was solid. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance was finally at peace. She picked up a smooth, river-worn stone from the table, a piece of Missouri granite she had found in the valley. She held it in her scarred hand, feeling its weight, its coldness, and its absolute reality. She closed her eyes and listened one last time, not for a threat, not for a slip, but for the simple, steady heartbeat of a planet that was still here. It was the only thing that mattered. She set the stone down on the map, a permanent weight on a changing world. The earth was quiet and the truth was enough.